Welcome to the ISC2 ISSAP Certification Masterclass. In this opening session, we will define the structural expectations of the course and outline how we navigate the complex landscape of information systems security architecture. This is an unofficial, independently produced course. It is not affiliated with, endorsed by, or connected to ISC2 in any way. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and does not guarantee passing the exam. All trademarks belong to their respective owners. This course is designed to transition you from a generalist CISSP perspective into the specialized, high-level strategic role of a security architect. Achieving the ISAP credential requires that you already maintain a CISSP certification in good standing, as this ensures a baseline of common security knowledge. Beyond the prerequisite, the exam assesses your ability to act as a bridge between abstract business goals and the concrete technical architectures that enforce those goals. We will move away from simple definitions and instead focus on the synthesis of architectural components to solve enterprise-level challenges. By focusing on this depth, we transform your study time into a targeted preparation strategy that prioritizes architectural reasoning over rote memorization. The curriculum is structured across 6 primary domains that mirror the official exam blueprint, covering everything from governance and risk management to cryptography and security operations. Each chapter is constructed to help you analyze how security controls must be integrated into the infrastructure rather than bolted on as an afterthought. You will learn to evaluate architectural frameworks and apply them to diverse environments, including cloud, hybrid, and industrial control systems. We examine the trade-offs inherent in every design decision, such as the tension between system performance and the overhead of robust encryption, or the balance between accessibility and strict identity management. This systematic approach ensures you develop the critical thinking skills necessary for the high-level scenario-based questions that define the ISAP assessment. To make the most of this course, you should treat the material as a series of building blocks where each lesson informs the next. We will dissect how enterprise security architecture functions as a mechanism for risk reduction while supporting organizational agility. We will explore how to translate regulatory and legal requirements into technical specifications that can be implemented reliably across an entire global infrastructure. Because the exam is focused on professional judgment, we focus on the why and how of architectural alignment rather than just the what. This method allows you to apply the principles we discussed to any environment, regardless of the vendor-specific tools that might be present in your own professional life. Developing a mindset for architectural assessment is at the heart of our journey together. You will see that technical implementations fail most often due to gaps in communication between the business layer and the technology layer, a disconnect that an architect is uniquely responsible for mending. We will explore the rigorous design principles required for ensuring high availability, system resilience, and compliance with privacy mandates. By maintaining a focus on the strategic alignment of security, you will be prepared not only to pass the certification exam, but to apply these concepts when designing secure systems in your daily work. We are now ready to begin this technical, rigorous transition into advanced security architecture. I look forward to guiding you through this material in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will explore the critical discipline of aligning information security architecture directly with broader business strategy to ensure your technical designs support organizational goals. Choosing the right certification path is a significant investment, and the ISAP designation is arguably the pinnacle for security architects. This course is specifically engineered to bridge the gap between abstract technical security controls and the pragmatic realities of global business governance. We move far beyond standard textbook definitions to provide you with the professional intuition required to navigate boardroom-level discussions. By the end of this curriculum, you will possess the precise architectural framework needed to demonstrate how security expenditures directly facilitate corporate market agility. You will learn to speak the language of risk, compliance, and strategic vision, transforming your role from a technical gatekeeper into an indispensable business architect. Architecting for the enterprise requires more than just deploying firewalls. It demands a fundamental alignment between your security posture and the core business objectives of the organization. If the mission of a company is to achieve rapid market expansion through cloud-native innovation, a rigid, perimeter-based security architecture will inevitably act as a structural bottleneck. Instead, your architectural responsibility is to construct a framework that serves as a business enabler by translating high-level corporate vision into measurable technical requirements and operational constraints. You must begin by analyzing the organization's mission statement and strategic objectives to determine which security capabilities are essential for safeguarding the value chain. This alignment allows you to position security as a proactive quality attribute rather than a reactive overhead expense, which is the hallmark of a mature security architecture discipline. Understanding the cultural and organizational boundaries within an enterprise is just as important as selecting the right cryptographic standards. Every organization operates under a unique governance model that dictates how decisions are made, how resources are allocated, and where accountability resides. You must evaluate these existing structures to ensure your architectural proposals are not rejected due to a misalignment with local corporate culture. For example, in a decentralized, highly collaborative environment, implementing a heavy-handed, centralized access control policy may face significant internal friction or even workarounds. You are effectively designing an ecosystem where technical controls must respect the autonomy of business units while maintaining visibility and integrity across the entire organizational boundary. Budgetary constraints represent a hard reality that every security architect must reconcile with their technical ambition. When you map security capabilities to business drivers, you generate an evidentiary basis that senior management can use to justify security investments. This is where the development of key performance indicators or KPIs becomes essential, as they translate technical security data into a format that reflects operational health. Similarly, key risk indicators provide a forward-looking perspective, alerting stakeholders to potential threats before they manifest as business-ending events. By linking these metrics back to the business strategy, you ensure that every dollar spent on a security service correlates with a tangible reduction in business risk. This alignment is what separates a tactical security administrator from a strategic security architect, providing the transparency required to sustain long-term security funding. Technical constraints should never be arbitrary, as they must flow directly from a documented assessment of risk and governance requirements. If your business strategy relies on high availability and continuous uptime, your architecture must inherently prioritize resiliency over extreme levels of data obfuscation that might introduce latency. This is the synthesis of business risk management. You are not merely securing an asset, but choosing a level of assurance that is appropriate for the asset's role in the organization's success. Your goal is to create an architecture that scales with the business, adapting as the organization ventures into new market segments or adopts different operational models. By defining these constraints explicitly, you provide a clear roadmap for engineers while remaining tethered to the overarching financial and operational requirements of the boardroom. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will examine the enterprise security architecture frameworks necessary to build a cohesive and defensible security program. Enterprise security architecture frameworks serve as the scaffolding for translating ethereal business requirements into concrete security controls. Without a structured framework, security initiatives often devolve into reactive, fragmented deployments that struggle to map directly to business risks or compliance mandates. The goal of this chapter is to provide you with the professional rigor required to select, customize, and integrate these frameworks effectively. By the end of this session, you will understand how to harmonize heterogeneous architectural standards to address the complex, evolving needs of modern enterprises. We begin our technical exploration with SABSA, the Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture, which stands out as a top-down, business-driven methodology. Unlike some academic frameworks, SABSA is inherently lifecycle focused, utilizing a matrix structure that filters a single business requirement through 6 distinct layers. These layers, contextual, conceptual, logical, physical, component, and operational, ensure that security is never an afterthought, but rather an integral part of the business enablement strategy. By tracing business objectives through the contextual layer down to specific technical components, you can explicitly demonstrate how technology serves corporate value. Understanding the SABSA matrix is essential for moving beyond simple checklist compliance and toward demonstrable business risk management. In contrast to the security-specific domain of SABSA, we must also consider TOGAF, the Open Group Architecture Framework, which provides the architecture development method as its primary engine. The ADM is an iterative process that provides a comprehensive roadmap for developing an enterprise architecture, where security is woven into the preliminary, requirements management, and implementation governance phases. While TOGAF is broadly focused on the entire enterprise, including business, data, application, and technology architectures, its strength lies in the integration of security governance at every boundary. By embedding security into the iterative ADM cycles, architects ensure that security is not just an overlay, but a foundational component of the enterprise-wide project lifecycle. Recognizing the synergy between SABSA's security-first depth and TOGAF's breadth in systems planning is a hallmark of a mature ISAP professional. Furthermore, we must examine the Zachman framework, which functions as an ontology rather than a process methodology like TOGAF or a lifecycle framework like SABSA. Zachman provides a holistic view of the enterprise through a grid that categorizes components by asking the fundamental questions of what, how, where, who, when, and why. By aligning these perspectives, ranging from the executive planner to the actual technician, you gain a systemic approach to identifying gaps in security coverage where these dimensions fail to intersect. Combining this with NIST 800-39 standards for information security risk management allows you to formalize the governance structure that informs your technical architecture decisions. These frameworks collectively establish a repeatable, defensible logic that stands up to the rigorous scrutiny required by enterprise-level architecture audits. Ultimately, the mastery of these frameworks lies not in dogmatic adherence, but in the ability to adapt them to the unique constraints of your organizational environment. You are looking for a sustainable architecture that provides clear traceability from regulation to implementation and back to business strategy. ISO/IEC 27001 provides the normative governance structure upon which many of these designs are anchored, ensuring that information security management systems have clear boundaries and objectives. Integrating these varied frameworks creates a robust architectural blueprint that mitigates systemic risk while optimizing operational performance. As you apply these concepts in your design projects, prioritize the alignment of technical controls with the business objectives identified in the top-level architectural layers. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back, where we will now focus on the complex task of mapping global, legal, and regulatory mandates into our security architecture. This chapter provides the bridge between abstract legislative text and tangible technical implementation. As information systems architects, we often encounter a bewildering array of laws and regulations that vary significantly by jurisdiction. Whether we are dealing with the broad dictates of the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe or the sector-specific requirements of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act in the United States, the fundamental challenge remains the same. Regulations are rarely written in a language that translates directly into security controls like encryption standards or firewall configurations. Instead, they specify outcomes, such as the protection of personal identifiable information or the necessity for audit integrity. Our objective is to ensure that these external mandates are dissected, categorized, and translated into specific internal control requirements that our engineering teams can actually implement. If we fail to perform this mapping correctly, we end up with gaps where legal liabilities hide in plain sight because the technical personnel misunderstood the intent of a particular regulatory clause. One of the most effective tools in our arsenal for this purpose is the Requirements Traceability Matrix. You should think of this matrix not as a one-time documentation exercise, but as a living architectural artifact that links every regulatory requirement to a specific security policy and, subsequently, to a concrete technical control. For instance, when mapping a requirement like the CCPA mandate for data minimization or the PCI DSS requirement for protecting stored cardholder data, you must document the specific architectural component, such as a database encryption service or an access tokenization engine, that fulfills that mandate. This allows for a verifiable trail during third-party audits, where you can move from a legal requirement down through your design documentation all the way to the code or configuration settings in production. By maintaining this link, you transform compliance from a reactive, chaotic scramble during audit time into an inherent, verifiable feature of your system architecture. Navigating cross-border data transfers and sovereign data limitations adds another layer of architectural complexity that cannot be overlooked. Different countries impose distinct rules on where data may reside and who may access it, often creating jurisdictional conflicts if your infrastructure is globally distributed. You must design your data plane with these constraints in mind, perhaps by utilizing regionalized hosting or sovereign cloud solutions to ensure that personal data does not transit through unauthorized jurisdictions. Furthermore, adopting a privacy by design approach means that regulatory constraints are considered at the earliest stages of the architecture development process, rather than being bolted on as an afterthought. This requires a deep understanding of data classification, ensuring that the most sensitive data is always governed by the most stringent compliance framework present in your environment. By standardizing on the most restrictive set of controls required across your operating regions, you can simplify the overall architecture and reduce the risk of non-compliance. Focusing on these mappings ensures you are well equipped to handle the rigorous scrutiny of the exam. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to the chapter on Enterprise Risk Management Architecture, where we will translate abstract threats into concrete architectural requirements. We will specifically focus on integrating risk frameworks into the core design of your enterprise information systems. Enterprise risk management is not a peripheral administrative task, but a foundational pillar of secure architecture. At its heart, ERM requires us to speak the language of the business rather than just the language of bits and bytes. When we look at frameworks like ISO 31000, we see a structured approach that emphasizes context, communication, and systematic monitoring. NIST SP 830 takes this further by providing a granular guide on how to conduct assessments that are repeatable and defensible. However, the real sophistication comes when we apply methodologies like the factor analysis of information risk, or FAIR. FAIR allows us to move away from subjective high, medium, low ratings towards probabilistic models that quantify loss magnitude and event frequency. By adopting these frameworks, an architect provides the board with a financial justification for security investments. We are essentially mapping technical vulnerabilities to potential business losses, which is the only way to gain executive buy-in. An architect who can articulate risk in dollars is far more valuable than one who only lists CVE scores. Understanding the distinction between inherent and residual risk is critical for any serious security design. Inherent risk is the level of exposure that exists before we implement any specific architectural controls or countermeasures. Once we deploy an architecture, the risks remaining are what we classify as residual risk. As architects, our goal is rarely to eliminate all risk, as that would bring business operations to a complete standstill. Instead, we aim to drive residual risk down to a level that aligns with the organization's stated risk appetite. We have four primary strategic treatments for the risks we identify: avoidance, mitigation, transference, and acceptance. Avoidance implies changing the system architecture to eliminate the risky component entirely, such as choosing not to collect sensitive PII to reduce compliance scope. Mitigation is the bread and butter of our work, involving controls like encryption, segmentation, or auditing. Transference involves pushing the risk elsewhere, typically through insurance or utilizing a managed service provider who assumes responsibility under a contract. Acceptance is the intentional decision to live with the risk, provided it falls within the authorized thresholds. Designing a risk register is effectively an exercise in creating a central source of truth for your security posture. This register should not be a static spreadsheet that is forgotten immediately after an audit, but rather an active component of your design documentation. It forces us to document the business impact analysis, which identifies the criticality of assets and the consequences of their loss. We need to perform these analyses to ensure that our security budget is spent on the systems that actually drive revenue or operational survival. Once the register is built, we must anchor it to a continuous monitoring system that feeds data back into our assessments. If a new vulnerability surfaces or a business process shifts, the risk register should be updated. This creates a feedback loop that informs future design decisions and prevents the architectural rot often associated with set-it-and-forget-it security. Every control you propose should be traceable to an entry in this register, demonstrating that your design is a measured response to a validated threat. Communicating these complex profiles to the C-suite requires a shift in perspective away from technical granularities and towards systemic business impact. Executives generally do not care about the specifics of a buffer overflow as much as they care about the impact on market reputation, regulatory fines, or product delivery timelines. When we present to the board or senior management, our architecture must be contextualized within the broader organizational goals. Use the data from your FAIR analysis to explain that a specific investment will reduce the frequency of a breach by a certain percentage. Show them how the current architectural design maps to the company's risk maturity level and long-term resilience goals. By positioning yourself as a risk advisor, you transition from being a gatekeeper to a business enabler. Your architectural requirements should act as a hedge against volatility, ensuring the organization can continue to function even under adverse conditions. This is the definition of professional security architecture. I will see you in our next session. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the hierarchical structure of security documentation and how to architect an enforceable governance framework. When we approach the challenge of security architecture, it is easy to become fixated on the technical controls such as firewalls or encryption algorithms. However, these technical decisions exist in a vacuum unless they are anchored by a robust policy framework. A well-designed security policy architecture acts as the governing constitution for your entire information ecosystem. It translates high-level business objectives into actionable constraints, ensuring that security is not just an afterthought, but a foundational business requirement. Without this structure, an organization naturally drifts toward operational inconsistency, which is where most significant security gaps emerge. As architects, our goal is to design a framework that is both prescriptive enough to guide behavior and flexible enough to adapt to changing business needs. The foundation of this framework starts with enterprise security policies, which represent the board-level commitment to security and define the overarching vision. Policies themselves should be technology agnostic because they need to remain relevant even as your underlying hardware and software stacks evolve. Beneath the policy layer, we implement standards, which provide the mandatory specifications for how policies are achieved in practice. For instance, if your policy dictates that all sensitive data must be encrypted at rest, your standard defines the specific acceptable encryption algorithm, such as AES-256, and the key length required. Standards are the bridge between strategy and operation, turning abstract goals into verifiable benchmarks that every system owner can understand. Skipping this step often leaves engineers with too much discretion, which leads to fragmented and non-compliant implementations. Beyond standards, we develop guidelines and procedures to ensure operational success. Guidelines offer recommendations or best practices that, while not strictly mandatory, steer developers and administrators toward more secure configurations. Procedures, conversely, are your step-by-step instructions for specific tasks, such as how to provision a new user account or how to respond to a detected unauthorized access attempt. By separating these documents, you avoid creating a rigid, monolithic handbook that no one reads. Instead, you create a tiered ecosystem where high-level directives stay stable while operational procedures remain agile. This modular approach is essential because updating a single operational procedure should not require a reapproval of the entire corporate security policy. Design considerations must also extend to the lifecycle management of these documents, as a stale policy is often worse than no policy at all. We must build a formal review cycle into our architecture, ensuring that governance documents are audited regularly against shifting regulatory requirements and internal business changes. This process involves a governance committee that oversees the lifecycle, from initial drafting and stakeholder sign-off to periodic sunsetting of outdated directives. Architects should consider how this committee structure integrates with the organization's existing decision-making bodies. It is equally critical to establish a documented exception process. There will always be edge cases where a standard cannot be met due to legacy system limitations or unique business constraints. And having a formal, risk-accepted pathway for handling these exceptions prevents shadow IT and policy bypass. The final piece of the architectural puzzle is enforcing these policies through automation. We should move away from the traditional manual compliance checking which is prone to human error and scaling issues. Instead, we can embed policy requirements directly into the infrastructure as code templates and continuous integration pipelines. When a system is provisioned, the automated build process can verify that it complies with the defined standards before it is even authorized to join the production environment. By leveraging configuration management tools to continuously monitor the state of our infrastructure, we can identify governance drift in near real time. This creates a state of continuous compliance, where the architecture itself serves as the primary mechanism for enforcement. We are not just writing documents, we are designing a programmatic environment where compliance is the default state of the system. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our journey through the complexities of information systems architecture. In this session, we will examine the critical role of GRC technology suites in unifying organizational security efforts and ensuring continuous compliance oversight. When we approach the selection and integration of GRC platforms, it is tempting to view them merely as repositories for policy documents or compliance checklists. However, a mature architectural perspective recognizes that a GRC system must function as the central connective tissue between siloed operational data and high-level business strategy. To design an effective integration, we must first focus on the ingestion architecture, which determines how heterogeneous data feeds from vulnerability scanners, asset inventories, and configuration management databases are normalized for risk calculation. If we neglect the quality of these upstream data sources, the GRC platform will inevitably suffer from the garbage in, garbage out phenomenon, rendering executive reports unreliable. We need to define clear schema mappings for each feed, ensuring that an asset detected by a discovery tool matches the corresponding record in your inventory system before risk scores are recalculated. This integration strategy allows the platform to move beyond static data entry and toward a model of automated risk management workflows, where a high-severity vulnerability trigger in a scan report automatically initiates an exception request or remediation ticket. Once the data is flowing, the architectural focus shifts toward automation and the realization of a unified risk dashboard that provides meaningful visibility into the organization's posture. As architects, we should design these dashboards to move away from technical jargon and instead translate security findings into business impact metrics that resonate with stakeholders and executive boards. This involves mapping technical vulnerabilities to business processes and assets, which requires a robust underlying dependency model that links infrastructure components to the critical services they support. When we automate evidence collection for regulatory audits, we significantly reduce the burden on operational teams by pre-populating audit workbooks with continuous monitoring data instead of manual snapshots. This design must explicitly account for third-party risk management by incorporating vendor profiles into the broader ecosystem, allowing us to track risk posture across the supply chain just as we do for internal systems. By standardizing the format of evidence, whether it is a log export, a configuration dump, or a signed policy acknowledgement, we enable the GRC engine to perform automated compliance checks against frameworks like ISO 27001 or NIS 800-53 without requiring constant human intervention. Managing policy exceptions represents another critical pillar of a well-architected GRC solution that often goes overlooked during the initial procurement phase. An effective architecture must provide an auditable and time-bound lifecycle for these exceptions, ensuring they are automatically reviewed and escalated if they near expiration or if the risk environment changes. We must define the programmatic triggers that invalidate an exception, such as an increase in the sensitivity of the associated data or a change in the threat landscape. Integration with a centralized identity provider is essential here, as it ensures that the delegation of authority for approving these exceptions aligns with internal governance and segregation of duties requirements. By codifying these exception flows within the GRC platform, we create a transparent record of risk acceptance that satisfies internal audit and regulatory scrutiny. Ultimately, the architecture we build should serve as a dynamic engine for decision-making, where the platform doesn't just store what we are doing, but actively informs how we secure the enterprise by reconciling real-time technical reality with organizational policy. I look forward to discussing these architectural design patterns with you further in our next session. Welcome to this exploration of advanced threat modeling, where we shift from reactive patching to proactive architectural design. In this chapter, We will master the frameworks and analytical techniques necessary to identify systemic vulnerabilities before a single line of code is deployed. Threat modeling is fundamentally a systematic exercise in empathy for the adversary, allowing us to anticipate how a sophisticated actor might decompose our architecture. By constructing precise data flow diagrams, we move beyond high-level abstractions to map explicit interactions between system components, human actors, and data stores. A well-constructed diagram defines system boundaries and trust zones with technical rigor, ensuring that every transition of data across a boundary is scrutinized for potential exposure. When we identify entry points within a multi-tier application or a cloud-native service mesh, we are essentially cataloging the attack surface that must be hardened against unauthorized permutations of flow. This methodical decomposition is the bedrock of secure architecture because it forces architects to justify the trust state of every subsystem, whether it resides in a legacy data center or a transient container environment. To facilitate this analysis, mature organizations rely on specialized frameworks like STRIDE, which remains the industry standard for identifying specific threat categories such as spoofing, tampering, and information disclosure. While STRIDE provides a granular checklist for developers and architects, other methodologies like PASTA or the Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis offer a risk-centric approach that aligns security outcomes directly with business objectives. By contrast, frameworks like Lindon are tailored specifically for privacy by design, focusing on identifiers and linkability of data, whereas VAST and TRIKE provide scalable approaches suitable for the complex, automated workflows found in modern DevOps pipelines. Choosing the right framework often depends on whether your priority is technical component hardening or strategic risk alignment, though the most effective architectures often synthesize elements from multiple models to achieve comprehensive visibility. Once a threat is identified, the challenge shifts from discovery to quantification, where we must determine which risks justify immediate intervention. Metrics such as BREAD, standing for damage, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, and discoverability, provide a qualitative scoring system that helps stakeholders prioritize remediation efforts based on their specific environmental context. Alternatively, many architects gravitate toward the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, which offers a more standardized, industry-accepted metric for severity, although it remains critical to augment these objective scores with subjective environmental impact assessments. Converting these scores into actionable security requirements is the bridge between analysis and engineering, ensuring that identified vulnerabilities are not merely documented, but are integrated into the system's formal architectural blueprints. This transformation ensures that every mitigation, whether it is an identity-based access control or an encryption requirement, is mapped back to the specific threat vector it was designed to neutralize. In hybrid and cloud-native environments, the complexity of the threat landscape is compounded by ephemeral resources and complex inter-service dependencies. Traditional network-centric modeling often fails here, requiring us to look deeper into the orchestration layer, service-to-service authentication mechanisms, and the configuration of immutable infrastructure. We must treat these environments as dynamic graphs of interconnected assets, where a vulnerability in an identity provider or a misconfigured role-based access policy can escalate into a catastrophic systemic breach. By using automated threat modeling tools integrated into the architecture phase, we can maintain the fidelity of our risk posture even as the underlying infrastructure undergoes rapid, programmatic change. The goal is to create a living document that evolves alongside the product, ensuring that our architectural defenses remain relevant against the changing tactics of modern adversaries. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to our exploration of Zero Trust architecture, where we move beyond legacy assumptions to build modern, resilient systems. In this session, we will dissect the fundamental principles that define a Zero Trust model and how those principles translate into functional components for your enterprise architecture. The central theme of Zero Trust is the abandonment of the traditional perimeter-centric defense model, which operated on the flawed assumption that everything inside the network is implicitly trusted. History has taught us that internal threats, compromised credentials, and lateral movement by attackers make this model inherently fragile. Instead, we adopt the mindset of assuming that a breach has already occurred or is inevitable, which forces us to verify every single access request regardless of its origin. This paradigm shift requires us to move the focus of our security controls from the network boundary to individual assets and identity. It is a fundamental decoupling of security from the physical or logical location of the user or device. By enforcing continuous verification, we ensure that trust is never binary or permanent, but always conditional and fleeting. According to the NIST SP 800-207 standard, Zero Trust architecture revolves around three core tenets: verifying explicitly, using least privileged access, and assuming breach. Explicit verification requires that we authenticate and authorize every access request based on all available data points, such as user identity, location, device health, and service patterns. Least privileged access mandates that we provide just enough access to perform a specific task, limiting the potential blast radius of a compromised account. Assuming breach forces us to encrypt traffic, segment networks, and monitor for unauthorized activity, as if an adversary is already patrolling our internal systems. These pillars are not just lofty goals, but are strictly operational requirements that dictate how we handle data flow in a distributed environment. We are ultimately building a system that treats the local area network with the same level of suspicion as it would the public internet. To implement these tenets technically, we need to understand the relationship between the policy engine, the policy administrator, and the policy enforcement point. The policy engine acts as the central brain, making the final decision on whether to allow or deny access based on gathered telemetry and organizational policy. The policy administrator is the mechanism that communicates this decision back to the environment, effectively opening or closing the gate. The policy enforcement point is the actual gateway, the firewall, the reverse proxy, or the software load balancer that sits right in front of the resource being requested. These components work in a tight loop where every request for a resource triggers a check against current context and policy. By separating the control plane from the data plane, we gain the flexibility to change security posture without reconfiguring the underlying network infrastructure. Designing microperimeters is perhaps the most practical application of these principles in an existing hybrid environment. Rather than relying on a single outward-facing firewall, we wrap individual applications or service groups in their own dedicated policy enforcement layer, effectively creating a software-defined perimeter. This approach prevents an adversary from moving laterally because even if they manage to compromise one workload, they still face another set of authentication gates to reach the next. We achieve this by integrating device health checks, measuring whether an endpoint is patched, encrypted, and free of malware, into the authorization decision. If a user tries to access a sensitive database from a device with an outdated operating system, the policy engine denies the request instantly. This contextual awareness ensures that we are protecting data based on the integrity of the entire ecosystem, not just the user's password. Transitioning legacy systems into a zero-trust model presents significant operational challenges, specifically regarding user experience and latent connectivity expectations. You cannot simply flip a switch and enable strict enforcement without identifying the dependencies that define your application's normal behavior. My advice is to focus on observability first, mapping the communication flows and identity requirements before introducing blocking controls. By implementing these controls incrementally, you can provide the necessary security improvements without degrading the performance or accessibility that users rely on for their daily work. Over time, you will find that a well-architected zero-trust model actually simplifies security by centralizing policy management and reducing the complexity of managing thousands of fragmented firewall rules. It is about building a system that is inherently resilient, rather than one that relies on the flimsy hope that the perimeter will hold indefinitely. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome to our deep dive into the foundational pillars of secure design. In this chapter, we will translate the timeless principles of Sulzer and Schroeder into the practical realities of modern enterprise architecture. Design principles often feel like academic theory until you attempt to apply them to a distributed, multi-tenant cloud environment. When we discuss the principle of least privilege, we are not simply talking about user accounts. We are evaluating how to restrict the capabilities of service identities within a microservices mesh. If every pod in your container orchestration platform has broad access to your secret store, you have essentially nullified the benefit of microsegmentation. Translating this into architecture requires that we treat every API call as a potential security boundary, ensuring that both human operators and automated components possess only the permissions required for their specific function. This constraint forces us to adopt granular identity models, which unfortunately adds complexity to our CI/CD pipelines, forcing a trade-off that we must carefully manage. Separation of duties acts as a necessary counterweight to the power of automated systems, particularly in environments where infrastructure as code is the norm. In a traditional environment, you might have restricted root access, but today, infrastructure engineers often control the entire CI/CD lifecycle from commit to production. By architectural design, we must decouple the ability to modify infrastructure code from the ability to approve its deployment, ideally through automated policy enforcement. This is not about slowing down velocity, but rather about ensuring that a compromised administrative credential does not grant universal control over the deployment environment. We must look at our architectural decisions through the lens of fail-safe defaults, ensuring that when an automated process fails, it defaults to a secure, restricted state rather than an open one. Open design serves as a reminder that security should never rely on the secrecy of the underlying mechanism, a concept that feels increasingly relevant in our age of pervasive open source components. When we architect for the cloud, we accept that our perimeter is no longer a physical wall, so we rely on the robustness of our encryption and authentication protocols rather than hidden, obscure configurations. Economy of mechanism is perhaps the most difficult principle to maintain in enterprise environments, given the constant pressure to add layers upon layers of security tools. Each new layer of security adds complexity, which in turn inevitably introduces hidden attack surfaces and maintenance burdens. A truly elegant architecture strives for simplicity by integrating security directly into the fabric of the platform, rather than bolting it on as an afterthought. Complete mediation is the requirement that every access request to every object must be checked for authority. In distributed systems, this is where many architects lose their way by assuming an initial authentication check is sufficient for subsequent internal requests. Once a user or service is inside the outer fortress, there is often a dangerous tendency to trust internal traffic implicitly. However, a robust architecture mandates that each microservice or API endpoint validates the authorization context independently, regardless of where the request originated. This leads us to the concept of the least common mechanism, where we avoid shared state or shared infrastructure components that could become a single point of failure and a shared point of compromise. By isolating components and ensuring they do not rely on excessive shared resources, we drastically reduce our blast radius during a security incident. Balancing these theoretical abstractions against operational constraints is the hallmark of an effective security architect. Performance and scalability frequently clash with complete mediation, as the latency introduced by constant identity verification can become a bottleneck in high-throughput systems. Consequently, we must design for caching mechanisms that do not sacrifice the integrity of the authorization check, which requires a deep understanding of token lifetimes and revocation propagation. We also weigh the cost of these controls against the likelihood of a threat against a specific asset, because an architecture that is perfectly secure but unusable will simply be bypassed by developers. Our duty is to ensure that security is not a friction point that breaks the system, but a durable framework that survives the inevitable evolution of threat actors over the long operational life of the enterprise. I look forward to discussing how these design goals influence our broader system resiliency in the next section. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the architectural principles necessary to build highly resilient systems capable of maintaining uptime despite environmental or malicious disruptions. Building a resilient architecture begins with the fundamental realization that hardware will fail, software will crash, and external dependencies will eventually become unreachable. When we architect for fault tolerance, we are essentially building a system that can absorb these failures without impacting the end user. The first step involves the systematic identification of single points of failure, or SPUFs, which exist at every layer of the stack. If your entire application logic resides on a single physical server, or if your database depends on a single power circuit, you have a SPOF. To mitigate these risks, we employ redundant topologies, essentially ensuring that for every critical component, there is a secondary or tertiary sibling ready to take over. This is not merely about duplicating hardware, but ensuring that the failover process is automated, seamless, and does not introduce latency or data corruption. Load balancing sits at the heart of high availability by distributing incoming traffic across multiple nodes. By acting as a traffic director, the load balancer ensures that no single server becomes overwhelmed, which inherently increases the overall throughput and reliability of the architecture. However, the load balancer itself can become a SPOF if not deployed in a high availability cluster, often using protocols like VRRP or hardware-based heartbeat signals to confirm operational status. When a node stops responding to health checks, the load balancer must instantly route traffic elsewhere, effectively masking the failure from the user. This logic extends to the storage layer, where storage area networks leverage replication and RAID configurations to protect data integrity against disk or controller failures. Without such mechanisms, the most robust compute environment becomes useless if the underlying data layer is inaccessible. In geographically distributed architectures, we push resilience to the next level by ensuring that entire data centers can fail without stopping business operations. This design choice necessitates careful planning regarding data replication between sites, as network latency becomes the primary constraint on synchronization speed. You must choose between synchronous replication, where consistency is guaranteed, but performance is impacted by round-trip times, and asynchronous replication, which offers better performance but potentially sacrifices the state of the data during a sudden, catastrophic failover. This trade-off is central to the CAP theorem, which dictates that in the presence of a network partition, you must choose either availability or consistency. Architects must decide where the business requirements lie on this spectrum to define the appropriate data protection mechanism for each tier of the application. Calculating resilience metrics allows us to communicate architectural requirements to stakeholders using quantitative data rather than abstract feelings. The mean time between failures, or MTBF, provides a measure of reliability, suggesting how long a component is expected to operate before needing replacement. Conversely, the mean time to repair, or MTTR, measures the efficiency of your maintenance and incident response processes. When you design an architecture, you aren't just trying to maximize MTBF, which is often limited by vendor hardware, but rather minimizing MTTR through automation, modular design, and robust monitoring. If a component fails, the system should ideally handle it gracefully, degrading service levels rather than crashing entirely. This concept of graceful degradation ensures that the most critical business functions remain active while peripheral features might be throttled or disabled. Finally, you must consider the reality of disaster recovery in the context of cyber attacks, where standard fault tolerance mechanisms might actually propagate the problem. If an attacker gains control of a primary server and your automated failover mechanism treats a malicious crash as a simple hardware fault, you might unwittingly propagate the damage to your secondary node or disaster recovery site. True resilience requires that your design includes integrity checks to ensure that the environment being failed over to is actually in a known, clean state. It is not enough for the infrastructure to stay online, it must stay online in a secure manner. This holistic view of availability and safety is what distinguishes a robust information system architecture from a mere collection of redundant parts. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will explore the architectural design patterns required to secure virtualization platforms and containerized environments. Virtualization security fundamentally depends on the integrity of the hypervisor, which serves as the thin abstraction layer between hardware and virtual machines. When we consider Type 1 hypervisors, which run directly on the host hardware, the security perimeter is defined by the management interface and the memory isolation mechanisms enforced by the processor. A Type 2 hypervisor, conversely, relies on the underlying host operating system for resource scheduling and hardware access, which increases the attack surface significantly. Architects must ensure that the hypervisor remains the smallest possible entity, often referred to as a microkernel design, to reduce the number of vulnerabilities within the privileged execution state. Virtual machine escape. The primary threat in this space occurs when a guest environment gains unauthorized access to the host's memory space or other co-resident virtual machines. Mitigation requires strict enforcement of interrupt request handling and I/O virtualization isolation, typically facilitated by hardware-assisted features like Intel VTD or AMD. Hypervisor-based introspection provides an advanced mechanism for monitoring guest behavior from the outside, allowing us to detect malicious activity without introducing agents within the guest environment that could be tampered with by an adversary. This layer of oversight is critical for maintaining high-assurance boundaries in multi-tenant environments where the underlying hardware might be shared among mutually distrusting workloads. Moving from virtualization to containerization, we shift our focus from kernel-level isolation to process-level isolation, facilitated by namespaces and C groups. A container share the host kernel, which means that the security model shifts heavily toward protecting the container runtime and the integrity of the image distribution process. Designing a secure container registry involves implementing immutable tag references and automated scanning for known vulnerabilities at the point of ingestion. We must avoid the use of latest tags, which introduce non-deterministic state, and instead rely on cryptographic hashes to ensure that the image being deployed is exactly what was vetted during the build cycle. Within a Kubernetes orchestration framework, the control plane must be isolated from the worker nodes to prevent lateral movement if a node is compromised. This involves hardening the API server, enforcing mutual TLS for all communications between components, and strictly managing secrets using encrypted storage providers. The architectural goal is to treat the infrastructure as immutable, where configuration drift is prevented by replacing containers entirely rather than updating them in place. The concept of immutable infrastructure is effectively the marriage of continuous integration and declarative security assertions. By baking security policies directly into the container image, we ensure that every instance of the software carries its own defensive posture from startup. This process begins with a hardened base image, typically derived from a minimal operating system, to remove unnecessary binaries and attack vectors. During the CI/CD pipeline, static analysis tools and container linters inspect the Docker file or Kubernetes manifest for deviations from established security standards. Once validated, the image is signed using a framework like Notary or Cosign, providing a cryptographically verifiable provenance chain. In the runtime environment, we apply pod security standards that restrict privileged escalations, read-only root file systems, and the use of host namespaces. These controls act as guardrails, ensuring that even if an application code vulnerability is discovered, the impact remains contained within the narrow boundaries of the sandbox. Architecture for modern compute platforms is not merely about selecting the right software, but enforcing boundaries that acknowledge the shared nature of underlying resources. Whether we are dealing with virtual machines or containers, the fundamental requirement is to minimize the privileged attack surface while maximizing the observability of the environment. By applying these architectural patterns, we build systems that are resilient to both local escapes and network-borne attacks targeting the control plane. We must shift our mindset from passive defense to a proactive posture where security is a prerequisite for deployment. This requires a deep understanding of how resource isolation is achieved at the instruction level and how orchestration platforms manage those abstractions at scale. Through constant validation, we guarantee that the security properties remain intact throughout the entire lifecycle of the workload. We are essentially transforming the infrastructure into a verifiable state machine where every transition is tracked, logged, and scrutinized for adherence to the original security requirements. See you in the next one. Welcome back. In this chapter, we explore the essential methodologies for ensuring that your implemented security architecture matches its design requirements through rigorous verification and validation processes. Verification and validation are often conflated, yet they address fundamentally distinct aspects of architectural assurance. Verification is the process of confirming that you have built the system correctly, ensuring that the components function according to the specified technical parameters and security requirements. Validation, conversely, confirms that you have built the correct system, focusing on whether the implemented architecture actually fulfills the intended business goals and security outcomes. As architects, you must distinguish between these two, because a system can be verified as technically sound while failing to provide the necessary security posture requested by stakeholders. We will examine how these concepts translate into mechanical processes, starting with functional acceptance testing and user acceptance testing. These activities provide the empirical evidence required to prove that security controls are not just present, but effective against the threat models they were designed to mitigate. Functional acceptance testing represents the baseline for demonstrating that security features, such as encryption modules or authentication workflows, operate exactly as the design document stipulates. When we move to user acceptance testing, the perspective shifts from technical correctness to operational utility, ensuring that security controls do not inadvertently cripple the workflows they are meant to protect. It is at this intersection of usability and security that regressions often occur, which is why regression analysis must be integrated into your architectural lifecycle. Every time a new service is deployed or an existing security policy is modified, you must verify that previously working security functions remain intact. This requires a stable baseline of evidence, which is best maintained through highly granular test documentation that explicitly maps architectural controls to your original design specifications. Modern architectural design demands that we move beyond manual, periodic checks toward the automation of security validation within the continuous deployment pipeline. Integrating static application security testing into the build process allows us to identify vulnerabilities in code before it ever reaches a runtime environment. Simultaneously, dynamic application security testing enables the validation of security controls while the application is in an active state, providing insight into how the architecture behaves under simulated stress. By codifying these testing strategies into the pipeline, you create an immutable audit trail that proves the security posture is consistently maintained, despite the rapid velocity of modern software delivery. This approach transforms security from a static, once-a-year review into a continuous property of the architecture, effectively aligning it with the principles of DevSecOps. Architectural risk assessments form the bridge between abstract design and concrete validation, serving as the foundation upon which your testing strategy is built. You must perform these assessments periodically to ensure that the threat landscape has not shifted in a way that renders your existing controls obsolete or ineffective. When conducting a penetration test, you are essentially performing a form of validation that challenges the assumptions made during the design phase. However, a penetration test is only as valuable as the scope defined. As an architect, you must ensure that these tests are objective and focused on the critical control points identified in your architecture model. These methodologies, combined with independent third-party audits, provide a defensible assurance package that you can present to stakeholders and regulators to prove compliance and maturity. The primary challenge for an architect is the creation of objective evidence that can withstand the scrutiny of both internal quality assurance teams and external auditors. You need to standardize how your architecture reports its own state, which means moving away from anecdotal claims about security and toward measurable telemetry. Whether through automated logs, configuration snapshots, or the output of vulnerability assessments, this data serves as the technical validation of your design. When you design an architecture, you must contemplate how it will prove itself throughout its life cycle, including the maintenance of integrity and confidentiality. By treating the generation of audit-ready data as a primary architectural requirement rather than an afterthought, you ensure that the system remains both functional and compliant throughout its entire operational lifespan. See you in the next lesson. Welcome to the chapter on Infrastructure Security Architecture, where we will examine the transformative role of software-defined networking in modern enterprise environments. In this lesson, we will focus on the foundational abstractions of SDN and the specific security challenges inherent in this decoupled approach. Software-defined networking represents a departure from traditional distributed network management by decoupling the control plane from the data plane. Instead of relying on individual devices to make localized forwarding decisions based on stored internal configuration, the architecture centralizes control logic within a software-based SDN controller. The data plane, or forwarding plane, consists of network devices like switches and routers that perform the actual task of moving packets according to instructions received from the controller. This separation introduces a fundamental change in how we secure the infrastructure because the intelligence is no longer distributed inside every switch. From an operations perspective, this centralization promises agility, but it also creates a high-value, high-impact target that demands rigorous architectural security controls. The management plane functions as the top layer, providing the interface through which administrators interact with the controller, typically via northbound APIs. It is here that business logic and security policies are translated into actionable network configuration. Below this sits the control plane, which communicates with the data plane via southbound APIs, such as OpenFlow. When you design an SDN-based architecture, you must recognize that the northbound API is conceptually different from the control channel. The northbound interface often exposes programmable functionality to orchestration tools, which makes it an attractive vector for unauthorized configuration changes. Conversely, the southbound interface manages the underlying switches, and if an attacker compromises this channel, they gain the ability to manipulate traffic flows at the hardware level. Securing the SDN controller is the most critical task in this architecture because it acts as the single point of failure and the brain of the entire network. If an adversary gains administrative access to the controller, they can effectively reconfigure the entire topology, mirror traffic to unauthorized destinations, or bypass existing security perimeters. You should implement hardware security modules or trusted platform modules to ensure the integrity of the controller itself and the cryptographic keys used for API authentication. Furthermore, the controller must run on a hardened operating system with restricted physical and logical access. Since the controller is a software entity, it is subject to all traditional software vulnerabilities, necessitating an aggressive patch management and lifecycle policy that is integrated into your broader system design. The communication protocols used between the control plane and data plane, such as OpenFlow, are historically prone to eavesdropping and manipulation if left unencrypted. In a well-architected environment, all communication between the SDN controller and network devices must occur over TLS encrypted channels to prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. You must verify that the certificate authority responsible for issuing these identities is properly scoped and that certificates are rotated regularly. Without mandatory mutual authentication between the switch and the controller, an attacker could potentially inject a rogue switch into the network. This would allow an unauthorized device to receive topology updates or report false data, leading to a poisoned view of the network state that the controller would blindly accept. One of the most powerful architectural advantages of SDN is the ability to leverage network programmability for automated incident response. When your security infrastructure detects an anomaly, such as a localized infection, the controller can issue immediate updates to the data plane to quarantine the affected segments without impacting the rest of the enterprise. This dynamic reconfiguration capability allows for a proactive security posture where network topology is no longer static or brittle. You should design policies that allow the orchestration layer to trigger micro-segmentation changes based on threat intelligence inputs. By tying threat monitoring systems directly into the SDN management plane, you reduce the time from detection to mitigation from minutes to seconds, effectively shrinking the attacker's window of opportunity. Centralized control also enables the enforcement of consistent, programmable security policies that apply across heterogeneous environments, including on-premises data centers and multi-cloud footprints. In a traditional network, enforcing a uniform security policy across a hybrid environment often involved manual configuration of dozens of individual firewalls and appliances. With SDN, you can codify your security requirements as policies within the controller, which then calculates the necessary rules for the underlying physical and virtual switches regardless of location. This abstraction layer is essential for maintaining a clean security posture in complex architectures, as it prevents the configuration drift that occurs when engineers manage disparate hardware boxes. The architecture thus replaces manual, error-prone human intervention with a deterministic, policy-driven code execution model. As you consider the broader architectural strategy, remember that SDN provides a lens through which you can implement zero-trust principles at the network layer. By requiring every flow to be validated against a central policy engine before the control plane installs a rule, you can ensure that traffic adheres to the principle of least privilege. You are not just managing switches, you are architecting a programmable fabric that treats every bit of traffic as a potential risk. Ensure your design incorporates robust auditing and logging at each layer, as the centralized nature of SDN makes it easier to capture the intent behind every network change. Keep these principles in mind as you map out the control flow in your future infrastructure projects. I look forward to discussing the next topic in our curriculum. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will deconstruct modern network perimeter design by moving away from legacy flat network topologies and embracing microsegmentation as a primary defensive strategy. The traditional concept of a hardened perimeter, often likened to the castle and moat model, is no longer sufficient for modern, distributed enterprise environments. In a flat network, once an attacker gains initial access, lateral movement becomes trivial because internal assets lack granular isolation. Microsegmentation solves this by enforcing security policies at the workload level rather than just at the network boundary. This architectural approach requires a fundamental shift in how we think about traffic flow. We must learn to distinguish between north-south traffic, which flows between the data center and the external network, and east-west traffic, which represents the significant volume of communication occurring between internal workloads and servers. By treating every segment as its own microperimeter, we drastically shrink the attack surface available to unauthorized actors. Implementing microsegmentation requires choosing the right enforcement point, and these are generally categorized into hypervisor-based, host-based, and network-based methods. Hypervisor-based solutions allow the virtualization layer to manage traffic between virtual machines on the same physical host, providing centralized control without needing physical network reconfiguration. Host-based microsegmentation leverages agents on the operating system to apply granular firewall policies directly at the interface level, which is particularly effective for diverse or hybrid cloud environments. Network-based approaches rely on SDN-capable switches and routers to tag or isolate traffic based on security groups. Each method has its own performance trade-offs, and as an architect, you must determine which fits the latency requirements of your applications while ensuring consistent policy application across the fabric. Secure zone architectures are the foundational blueprints that enable this granular control. A well-designed architecture defines logical trust zones that group assets with similar security requirements, such as production database clusters or sensitive payment processing microservices. Instead of allowing broad access between subnets, we implement explicit allow lists that govern communication paths down to the application port and protocol level. This approach essentially turns every server into a participant in a distributed firewall system. When you integrate next-generation firewalls or web application firewalls into this design, you are not just filtering traffic by address. You are performing deep packet inspection to identify anomalous behavior within the established flows. Effectively managing this requires an automation-first mindset, as manual policy creation at this scale would quickly lead to configuration errors and operational bottlenecks. The core objective of these strategies is to prevent the lateral movement of threat actors inside the enterprise network. Even when a perimeter defense is breached, microsegmentation serves as the internal containment mechanism that prevents infection from propagating through the environment. By establishing workload-specific policies that operate continuously, we move away from static perimeter protection toward a dynamic security posture. This requires constant monitoring of east-west traffic to ensure that the baseline communication patterns of our applications haven't changed in an unauthorized way. When an intrusion occurs, the segmented nature of the design ensures that the damage is constrained to the smallest possible blast radius, granting security operations teams time to respond, isolate, and remediate the threat before it hits critical infrastructure. Successfully architecting this environment means moving away from the assumption that the internal network is inherently safe. If you design your zones based on the principle of least privilege, you naturally force every interaction between workloads to be authenticated and authorized. This requires a strong understanding of how modern identity systems can bridge with network policy to provide a cohesive security fabric. You are building towards an environment where policy follows the workload, whether it moves from a local server to a cloud-based container or remains on premises. As you move through this, consider how the complexity of your rule sets might affect system performance and administrative overhead. Balancing the granularity of your segments with the realities of operational maintenance remains the hallmark of a senior security architect. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. And today, we turn our attention to the architectural complexities inherent in securing IoT, OT, and SCADA environments. This chapter provides the critical insights you need to bridge the gap between traditional enterprise IT and the rugged, time-sensitive world of industrial control systems. In the realm of information technology, the security triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability generally prioritizes the protection of data. However, when we transition to operational technology and industrial environments, those priorities shift significantly toward availability and safety. Industrial control systems are designed for continuous, predictable operations, where a few milliseconds of latency can result in catastrophic physical consequences. Unlike a corporate server that can be rebooted during an update, a PLC controlling a power grid or a water treatment plant must remain operational without interruption. This fundamental divergence in priorities means that standard IT security controls, such as automated patch management or frequent vulnerability scanning, can often break legacy systems or cause dangerous downtime. To successfully conceptualize the security of these environments, we rely on the Purdue model for control hierarchy. This architectural framework segments industrial networks into distinct levels, ranging from the sensors and actuators in the physical process at level 0 up to the enterprise IT networks at level 5. By enforcing clear boundaries between these levels, we prevent the direct exposure of sensitive control equipment to the volatility of the public internet. Architects often employ industrial demilitarized zones and unidirectional security gateways to facilitate necessary data flow while ensuring that a breach in the enterprise layer cannot propagate down to the process control layer. A data diode, for instance, provides a hardware-based guarantee that information only travels in a single direction, effectively shielding the sensitive core from external influence. Much of the hardware currently running critical infrastructure is decades old and lacks the processing power for modern encryption. These legacy protocols were built on the assumption of a closed, trusted network, meaning they provide no authentication or encryption of their own. When we must secure these devices, we cannot simply wrap them in TLS. We must utilize compensating controls. This often involves placing these devices behind robust network proxies or using VPN tunnels that terminate at a hardened gateway. By abstracting the connectivity requirements away from the legacy endpoint, we allow the older protocol to communicate safely within a restricted, local segment while the gateway handles the burden of secure, authenticated transport across untrusted infrastructure. Maintaining integrity is equally paramount when dealing with field devices that are physically accessible to unauthorized parties. Incorporating a hardware root of trust, such as a trusted platform module or a secure element, allows the system to verify the integrity of its firmware during every boot cycle. If the firmware has been tampered with, the system refuses to initialize, preventing the execution of malicious code within the control loop. This architectural approach shifts the burden of trust from software-based checks, which can be bypassed via memory corruption, to immutable hardware checks. Designing for physical security at the endpoint prevents an attacker from gaining low-level persistence, which is critical when software-based detection might be slow or unreliable in an industrial setting. Finally, we must address the reality of remote access for the technicians who maintain these remote sites. Providing a field technician with broad VPN access is an architectural failure, as it effectively treats the industrial site as just another branch office. Instead, we implement a granular, just-in-time access model that uses brokered connections. The technician connects to a jump host, which subsequently proxies the session to the specific asset, with every action logged and monitored in real time. By integrating these strategies with physical environmental security, such as tamper-evident enclosures and motion sensors, we build a multi-layered defense that recognizes the unique physical and operational reality of the infrastructure we are protecting. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today, we are shifting our focus toward the architectural challenges inherent in designing converged network security infrastructures. When we talk about converged network security, we are essentially looking at the integration of voice, video, data, and unified communications into a singular, cohesive architectural framework. In traditional networking, these services were often siloed, allowing for rigid, perimeter-based security controls. Today, however, these services exist as high-level application flows that must be secured across a common transport medium. This convergence requires that we treat the network not just as a pipe for data, but as an active participant in security enforcement for real-time protocols. The fundamental challenge here involves ensuring that security controls do not inadvertently sacrifice the performance mandates of latency-sensitive services like VoIP or high-definition video conferencing. Addressing this requires a deep understanding of the protocols that underpin our communications. as well as the cryptographic mechanisms necessary to protect them from external interference. Voice over IP and Session Initiation Protocol, or SIP, trunking represent the primary attack surfaces in many modern converged environments. Because SIP is historically a text-based protocol, it is particularly susceptible to various forms of manipulation, such as call tampering or toll fraud. As an architect, your primary defense is the deployment of a session border controller, which acts as a secure gateway for signaling and media streams. By using a border controller, you can normalize SIP traffic, hide internal topology information, and enforce strict rate limiting to mitigate denial of service attempts. Furthermore, applying cryptographic encapsulation, such as secure real-time transport protocol, ensures that audio and video streams remain encrypted even if they traverse untrusted network segments. Without such encapsulation, these real-time streams are essentially clear text data, vulnerable to packet sniffing and unauthorized interception. Unified Communications as a Service introduces a distinct set of risks as we effectively extend our security perimeter into a third-party hosted environment. While the provider manages the underlying infrastructure, the architect remains responsible for ensuring that the connection between the corporate network and the cloud utility is resilient and authenticated. This is where quality of service controls become a security concern rather than just a performance necessity. If an attacker identifies the patterns associated with high-priority voice traffic, they may attempt to perform a resource exhaustion attack, effectively drowning out legitimate traffic through traffic shaping manipulation. By strictly defining and policing traffic classes at the ingress point, we ensure that our security architecture preserves availability even for the most sensitive communication flows. Relying solely on the provider for security is a common pitfall. Instead, you must maintain end-to-end visibility through robust logging and integrity monitoring. Beyond the application layer, we must address the security of the underlying infrastructure protocols that support any converged network. Protocols like DNS, DHCP, and NTP are often treated as trusted utilities, yet their compromise can facilitate man-in-the-middle attacks or synchronization exploits. Implementing DNSSEC provides an essential layer of integrity by cryptographically signing zone records, thereby preventing cache poisoning that could redirect legitimate voice or video traffic to rogue servers. Similarly, DHCP snooping serves as a critical defense mechanism within the access layer by ensuring that only authorized devices can act as legitimate sources for network configuration parameters. When we secure NTP through authenticated time sources, we protect the overall logging and monitoring infrastructure from time drift attacks that would otherwise invalidate audit trails and break certificate validation chains. These protocols form the substrate of your architecture, and neglecting them leaves the higher layer communications exposed. Finally, protecting these converged infrastructures against active threats requires a layered approach that combines encryption with deep inspection. Your design must account for the reality that converged systems are uniquely sensitive to denial of service, simply because the timing required for synchronization and call setup is so precise. By integrating hardware-based security modules or dedicated cryptographic engines into your edge devices, you can maintain performance while meeting the rigorous requirements for encryption at scale. Architects need to evaluate how data, voice, and video traffic interact under stress and ensure that the security architecture provides enough headroom for these protocols to fail gracefully. Security in this context is as much about availability as it is about confidentiality and integrity. The robustness of your converged design will ultimately be judged by how well it maintains both performance and a secure posture under the most demanding enterprise conditions. I look forward to discussing how these concepts interface with broader infrastructure designs in our next session. Welcome to this comprehensive deep dive into the practical realities of cloud and hybrid infrastructure design. We will navigate the complexities of shared responsibility models, multi-tenant isolation, and the modern tooling required to govern distributed ecosystems effectively. Cloud and hybrid infrastructure design requires a fundamental recalibration of how we perceive the security perimeter. In a traditional on-premises environment, the architect often controls the entire stack from the physical facility up to the application layer. When we transition to infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service, we shift into a shared responsibility model where the provider manages the underlying infrastructure elements like physical storage and compute, while the customer retains accountability for data, identity, and firewall configurations. Understanding exactly where these boundaries lie is critical because a misunderstanding here frequently leads to common misconfigurations. A provider may secure the hypervisor, but it remains your responsibility to patch the operating system in an IaaS model or manage access controls in a SaaS environment. Failing to define these operational boundaries precisely can result in significant security gaps that no amount of internal policy can patch. Achieving multi-tenant isolation remains one of the most technical challenges in cloud architecture designs. Since public cloud environments share physical hardware across different customers, robust logical isolation is mandatory through mechanisms such as virtual private clouds, subnets, and security groups. When architectural requirements necessitate hybrid connectivity, we must evaluate the trade-offs between IPsec VPNs and dedicated leased lines like AWS Direct Connect or Azure ExpressRoute. VPNs offer a lower barrier to entry and are often sufficient for non-latency sensitive workloads, whereas leased lines provide consistent, predictable performance and dedicated bandwidth that are indispensable for high-volume database synchronization. Choosing the right connectivity method involves balancing the cost of dedicated infrastructure against the resilience and throughput needs of your specific business objectives while ensuring the transit path itself remains encrypted and monitored. Modern cloud environments are too expansive for manual configuration or static audits, which is why Cloud Security Posture Management, known as CSPM, has become a core component of the architect's repertoire. CSPM tools provide the necessary visibility to identify misconfigured storage buckets, overly permissive access policies, and deviations from security benchmarks. Complementing this is Cloud Workload Protection, or CWPP, which focuses on protecting the actual workloads running within those infrastructures, regardless of whether they are hosted on virtual machines, containers, or serverless functions. These platforms allow us to enforce consistent security policies across a heterogeneous mix of on-premises servers and cloud environments. By integrating these tools, an architect can effectively move away from fragmented security management and toward a unified control plane that offers deep visibility into the entire asset inventory. Cloud infrastructure, entitlement management, referred to as CIEM, addresses the complex challenge of managing permissions and identities in a world replete with service accounts and human roles. In cloud environments, the sheer volume of fine-grained permissions creates significant complexity, often leading to excessive privilege grants that deviate from the principle of least privilege. CIEM solutions continuously analyze the difference between allowed privileges and those actually used, allowing architects to automatically right-size permissions and avoid the accumulation of stale, overscoped identity rights. This is vital when implementing zero-trust network architectures, as it ensures that access is time-bound and activity-based rather than tied to persistent, static credentials. When you layer CIEM on top of your existing cloud governance strategy, you gain a repeatable mechanism for managing identity lifecycle risks at scale. Architecting for a consistent security posture across disparate environments requires a disciplined approach to bridge the gap between on-premises legacy systems and dynamic cloud workloads. You should prioritize the creation of centralized policy enforcement points that can translate high-level business goals into specific, machine-readable configurations. Whether you are using infrastructure as code to deploy transit gateways or utilizing cloud-native security orchestration, the objective is to ensure that your security control fabric is as flexible as the cloud itself. By carefully mapping your regulatory obligations to these technical controls, you can build an architecture that provides not only robust protection, but also defensible, auditable status. The goal is to design an infrastructure that provides transparency into the state of security at all times, making it inherently easier to respond to security drifts or emerging threat landscapes. I look forward to discussing how these architectural concepts interplay in our next session together. Welcome to this new chapter where we will examine the critical integration of physical and environmental security into enterprise information systems architecture. We will look at how to build robust, resilient physical defense structures that safeguard your infrastructure against both natural and human-made threats. In the world of security architecture, it is common to fixate on bits and bytes while overlooking the physical reality that houses our data. However, a secure server is useless if someone can simply walk into the data center and pull the plug or physically copy data onto a drive. We must apply the defense in depth model to the physical world, creating layers of security that increase the cost and complexity of any unauthorized entry. This starts at the perimeter, where fences, barriers, and bollards should form the first deterrent against unwanted visitors. Moving inward, we implement identity verification at access control points, utilizing smart cards paired with biometric templates to ensure that the individual requesting entry is who they claim to be. Behind these gates, closed-circuit television systems act as both a deterrent and a recording mechanism for forensic analysis, provided they are monitored and maintained correctly. The goal is not just to prevent access, but to ensure that every movement within a sensitive area is logged and audited just as strictly as our network traffic. Environmental controls often get ignored until they fail, which is a dangerous oversight for any architect. When we talk about data center design, we must treat critical utilities like power, cooling, and fire suppression as fundamental components of the security stack. A well-designed facility includes redundant power infrastructures, such as uninterruptible power supplies and backup generators, to ensure that service continuity is maintained even during a catastrophe. Similarly, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems are not just for comfort, as they must maintain specific temperature and humidity levels to prevent hardware premature failure. Fire suppression is equally vital, requiring non-water-based chemical agents that can extinguish fires without destroying the sensitive electronics that keep your business running. Environmental monitoring sensors should be integrated into our broader security systems, feeding alerts directly to the Security Operations Center, so that a cooling failure or a localized flood is treated with the same urgency as a firewall intrusion. Geography plays a significant role in your risk posture, and an architect must account for external hazards that could impact the physical facility. You should evaluate the potential for natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, or floods based on the location of your data centers and office hubs. If your primary facility sits in a floodplain, your design strategy must either include significant structural elevation and sealing, or you must shift your architecture toward a disaster-resilient distributed model. Beyond natural forces, we must consider the risk of industrial accidents near our facilities, such as chemical spills or fires from neighboring businesses. By understanding the local risk landscape, we can harden our exterior walls, use reinforced glass, and arrange secure equipment in areas that are less vulnerable to structural damage. This strategic placement is essentially an application of risk management to architectural design, where we proactively neutralize threats before they can interrupt business operations. Designing for security is a continuous process that requires you to step away from the keyboard and consider the tactile nature of your assets. As you progress through your designs, remember that physical security often provides the foundation upon which your software and network security layers actually work. If an adversary gains physical access to your hardware, the most sophisticated encryption algorithms or network protocols will not prevent a compromise of your keys or a physical extraction of data. Therefore, you must ensure that your physical security measures are as well documented and architected as your virtual ones, with clear boundaries and fail-safe mechanisms at every layer. By taking a holistic approach, you create an environment where the hardware is as protected as the data it holds, reinforcing the total integrity of the enterprise architecture. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to explore the identity lifecycle and governance models, focusing on how to manage digital identities from creation to termination. The foundation of any robust identity management architecture begins with a clear understanding of the joiner-mover-leaver workflow, which dictates the complete lifecycle of a digital identity. When a user joins an organization, the provisioning process must be tightly coupled with human resources systems or, in the case of machines, with automated orchestration platforms to ensure consistency. As users transition between departments or roles, their access rights must be dynamically adjusted to reflect new responsibilities, a phase often referred to as the mover process. Failing to prune permissions during this shift is a primary cause of privilege creep, a silent but dangerous phenomenon where an identity accumulates access rights that are no longer required for its current function. The final phase, termination, requires an immediate and verifiable deprovisioning process that covers all entry points, from cloud-based SaaS applications to on-premises legacy systems. Automating these transitions is not merely a convenience, but a security mandate, as manual processes are notoriously prone to errors and delays that attackers readily exploit. You should look to implement a centralized identity governance and administration system that serves as the single source of truth for all identity-related activities within your enterprise ecosystem. Beyond the basic lifecycle, we must address the architectural choices that determine how we control access, specifically comparing role-based, attribute-based, and policy-based access control models. Role-based access control is the traditional approach, where permissions are bundled into roles assigned to users, which provides simplicity but can often lead to role explosion as the organization grows and requirements become more granular. Attribute-based access control moves the needle forward by making decisions based on specific characteristics of the user, the resource, and the environmental context, such as location or time of day. This is inherently more flexible and allows for complex expressions that can address nuanced business needs without creating thousands of distinct roles. Policy-based access control takes this a step further by abstracting the access logic into a central policy engine where security teams manage rules independently of the underlying applications. When architecting these systems, consider how you will reconcile identity data across disparate silos to ensure that the attributes you rely on for access decisions remain accurate and trustworthy over time. Governance also extends to non-human identities, which have become a significant, often overlooked portion of the corporate attack surface. Service accounts, API keys, and identities used by robotic process automation bots require the same rigorous lifecycle management as human employees. Yet they are frequently granted static, long-lived credentials that are never rotated. You must treat every service account as a high-risk entity by enforcing strict limitations such as hardware-based trust for signing, the use of secrets management vaults, and ephemeral tokens rather than permanent passwords. Furthermore, periodic access certification reviews are an essential governance component, forcing business owners to validate that the access granted to both humans and machines is still relevant based on the current business mission. These reviews should be an automated, repetitive process that flag anomalies or stagnant accounts for immediate investigation and remediation. By treating identities as an asset with a clear operational lifecycle, you create an environment where the principle of least privilege is not just a policy document, but a technical reality embedded in your infrastructure. I will see you in the next part of the course. Welcome to our deep dive into federated identity and trust models, where we will examine how to securely extend identity boundaries across organizational lines. This module provides the architectural framework necessary to design sustainable, cross-domain identity systems that meet the rigorous standards of modern enterprise environments. In a modern enterprise, the perimeter is no longer a static wall, but a fluid boundary that expands and contracts based on business needs. When we discuss federation, we are essentially moving away from the paradigm of local account management toward a model where identity is asserted rather than stored. From an architectural perspective, this requires a fundamental shift in how we handle trust. We are essentially delegating the verification of a user's identity to an external entity, known as the identity provider, while our own system acts as the relying party. The challenge for an architect is to ensure that this delegation does not introduce gaps that could be exploited by malicious actors seeking to intercept or spoof those assertions. We must focus on the underlying protocols, such as SAML or OIDC, to ensure that the token exchange is integrity protected and contextually aware. To understand the mechanics of scaling these systems, we need to look at specific trust topologies that define how organizations connect to one another. The simplest model is the mesh, where every partner is directly connected to every other partner in the ecosystem. As you might imagine, the complexity of a mesh architecture grows exponentially as you add participants, creating a configuration nightmare known as the n-squared problem. A more scalable approach is the hub and spoke model, where a central server acts as a broker for all authentication requests between disparate entities. This centralization reduces the overhead of maintaining configuration metadata, but creates a single point of failure that requires high availability and robust security hardening. If the central broker is compromised, the entire federated network loses its security posture. which is why architects must prioritize the resilience of the hub. When we scale further, we encounter the centralized clearinghouse model, which is often used in large industry-wide consortia or government-to-citizen services. Unlike a simple hub, a clearinghouse operates more like a sophisticated financial exchange for identity assertions, handling complex claims mappings and attribute transformation. The primary architectural advantage here is the decoupling of relying parties from identity providers, allowing both sides to scale independently without needing direct synchronization. However, this introduces significant risks regarding attribute exposure and potential privacy violations across the Federation. We have to be meticulous about what data is being shared, the scope of the claims, and how the relying party handles these attributes once they cross the boundary. Minimizing the scope of shared identity attributes to only what is strictly necessary remains a core tenet of secure architecture. The overhead of managing external identities often comes down to the governance of lifecycle events. When a user is provisioned in the partner organization, we have no inherent control over their status or permissions within that external directory. This creates a synchronization lag where an employee might be terminated at the source, yet still retain access to our systems via valid, unexpired federated tokens. We mitigate this through just-in-time provisioning and robust session management, ensuring that every authentication interaction is audited and subject to re-verification. We must also consider the risk profiles of the relying parties we are enabling. Not every partner maintains the same security maturity, and an architect must evaluate whether an external organization's identity hygiene meets our internal risk appetite before establishing a trust relationship. Designing these systems effectively means we must eliminate identity duplication, as redundant stores create inconsistencies that are notoriously difficult to remediate. By moving to a centralized claim-based model, we enforce a single source of truth for the user's identity attributes, regardless of their location. This visibility allows us to maintain a coherent audit trail of all authentication requests, even those traversing complex multi-domain environments. Maintaining this visibility requires integration with centralized logging and security information event management tools that can correlate events across the federated hub. Without this level of instrumentation, you are essentially flying blind, unable to distinguish between a legitimate federated login and a credential stuffing attack directed at your Federation endpoint. The goal is to build a system that is interoperable but strictly bounded by policy-driven trust. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back, where we will examine the technical underpinnings and design patterns of enterprise authentication and single sign-on architectures. When we approach the challenge of enterprise authentication, we must move beyond the simple concept of checking a password against a database. In modern distributed systems, authentication is a delegated exchange of claims, where an identity provider asserts the identity of a subject to one or more relying parties. The security assertion markup language, or SAML, remains a cornerstone of enterprise deployments, primarily utilizing XML-based assertions to transmit identity information between an asserting entity and a service provider. The strength of this architecture lies in the trust relationship established via metadata exchange, where certificates are trusted to sign assertions that prove the user's identity is valid. When designing for SAML, you must always ensure that the assertion consumer service endpoint is strictly protected by transport layer security to prevent interception, but also realize that the XML structure itself requires robust signature validation to prevent XML signature wrapping attacks. We often see scenarios where the processing of these assertions creates a bottleneck, so architects must balance the overhead of XML parsing against the necessity of strict cryptographic verification. In contrast to the static nature of SAML, OpenID Connect built upon the solid foundation of the OAuth 2.0 authorization framework, providing a more fluid, JSON-centric approach suited for web and mobile applications. OAuth 2.0 itself is not an authentication protocol. It is an authorization framework that facilitates delegated access to resources without sharing credentials. When we incorporate OIDC, we gain an identity layer on top of OAuth 2.0 that allows clients to verify the identity of the end user based on the authentication performed by an authorization server. The core mechanism involves the exchange of tokens, specifically identity tokens in JWT format, which carry claims that uniquely identify the authenticated user. As an architect, you are concerned with the flow types, such as the authorization code flow, which requires a backchannel communication to exchange a temporary code for an access token. By keeping the exchange isolated to the backchannel, we effectively mitigate the risk of token leakage that would otherwise occur if sensitive tokens were exposed via the browser's URL history or logs. Token mechanics are the lifeblood of these systems, and their life cycle must be managed with extreme care to maintain the integrity of the session. A token is essentially a bearer credential, meaning that if it is intercepted, the attacker can impersonate the legitimate user until the token expires. To counter this, we implement short-lived access tokens combined with longer-lived refresh tokens, which allow the system to obtain new access tokens without requiring the user to re-authenticate. Cryptographic signing of these tokens is non-negotiable. Whether using asymmetric keys for JWTs or symmetric keys for internal service communication, the trust must be verifiable by the consumer of the token. We must also consider the threat of replay attacks, where a captured token is maliciously presented to an endpoint to repeat an authorized action. This necessitates the use of nonces and timestamps within the claim's payload, ensuring that every token is strictly bound to its intended purpose in a specific time window. Designing a resilient SSO infrastructure requires careful consideration of the cross-domain cookie architecture and the broader session management strategy. When a user authenticates against an SSO provider, the session is often maintained through a central cookie, which must be partitioned or scoped correctly to prevent cross-site request forgery and cookie fixation vulnerabilities. If you are operating in a multi-tenant environment, you must decide whether to use a central identity hub or a distributed federation model where trust is transitive. A central hub offers easier auditing, as all authentication events are funneled through a single point of capture, which is essential for unified access monitoring and compliance reporting. However, this creates a significant availability risk, as a single point of failure could lock users out of the entire enterprise application stack. Therefore, your design should incorporate geographic redundancy for the identity services and ensure that failover mechanisms do not compromise the state of active sessions. Finally, architectural excellence in this domain is achieved by minimizing password fatigue while simultaneously enhancing threat surface visibility. By consolidating authentication through protocols like OIDC and SAML, we allow users to authenticate once and traverse disparate systems with automated token propagation, which naturally discourages poor credential management habits among the user base. From an auditing perspective, these protocols standardize the signals transmitted to your logging infrastructure, ensuring that identity-linked telemetry is consistent across the hybrid cloud estate. When we review the requirements for auditing, we look for the ability to correlate an authentication event from an OIDC provider with subsequent authorization requests to microservices. This correlation is only possible if we consistently propagate the necessary security context, typically through headers or custom claims in the token. If you design this correctly, you provide your SOC with high-fidelity identity data, which is far more actionable than static, local log files buried within individual application tiers. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to the module on directory services, where we lay the foundation for how your organization manages identity across complex, heterogeneous networks. We will examine how directory structures function as the backbone of your authorization and authentication strategy. In an enterprise environment, the directory service acts as the central authority for identity, providing the glue that binds disparate systems together. At its core, protocols like Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, or LDAP, facilitate the standardized retrieval and management of object attributes across distributed databases. Whether you are dealing with a traditional forest-based Active Directory structure or modern identity providers like Entra ID, the fundamental architecture remains a hierarchical tree structure. This hierarchy is designed to provide visibility and control over users, machines, and resources. When you design such a system, you are essentially defining the logical boundary of trust for your entire organization. An architect must consider these boundaries carefully because they determine the scope of administrative influence and the blast radius of a potential credential compromise. The topology of a directory, particularly within Active Directory, relies heavily on trees and forests to manage resource isolation and administrative delegation. A forest represents the ultimate security boundary, within which all objects share a common schema, configuration directory partition, and global catalog. Understanding this is critical because, contrary to popular belief, trust relationships do not simply bridge these boundaries. They define the flow of authentication. When you establish a trust, you are creating a path for identity assertions to be validated across domains. If you are designing for a large, decentralized enterprise, you must balance the need for global access with the principle of least privilege. Overly permissive forest-wide trusts effectively merge two security boundaries into one, which often unintendedly grants administrative rights to entities that should have been kept separate. Replication is often the most misunderstood aspect of directory architecture, yet it ensures the availability and integrity of your source of truth. Most directory services operate using a multi-master replication model, which allows for local updates at the cost of potential consistency delays. You must architect your site topology to account for network latency between domain controllers to prevent replication bottlenecks. If the directory cannot replicate changes efficiently, you lose your ability to enforce centralized security policies, such as account lockouts or password updates across geographical distances. Furthermore, security architects must ensure that the replication traffic itself is protected. By enforcing signing and encryption on replication channels, you prevent attackers from intercepting or injecting unauthorized directory objects during transmission from one domain controller to another. Schema management acts as the blueprint for your directory, defining what attributes exist for every object type. While it is tempting to extend the schema to accommodate custom application requirements, you should approach this with extreme caution. Once an attribute is committed to the schema, it is typically impossible to remove it, leading to permanent bloat and potential security vulnerabilities. From a security perspective, you must also constrain who has the authority to modify the schema. This level of access is essentially the keys to the castle, as a rogue schema update could theoretically redefine how the entire directory validates user permissions. Always audit schema modifications in your centralized logging environment to detect unauthorized alterations that could signify an attempt to bypass security controls. Securing your directory against sophisticated threats requires a deep understanding of how attackers exploit the underlying protocols themselves. Pass-the-hash attacks rely on the fact that NTLM authentication often relies on the hash of a password rather than the password itself. If an attacker gains access to this hash, they can masquerade as the user without ever knowing the clear text credential. Similarly, Kerberos golden ticket attacks target the Kerberos key distribution center service account, effectively granting the attacker long-term, unrestricted access to the entire domain. To mitigate these, you must implement tiered administration models that prevent high-privileged credentials from ever touching systems that could be easily compromised. By isolating domain admins to dedicated, hardened jump servers, you significantly reduce the surface area available to an adversary. Directory enumeration is the final precursor to many successful breaches, as attackers rely on this process to map out group structures and identify high-value targets. Because directory services are designed to be accessible to authenticated users, they often contain a wealth of information that can be easily queried using tools like LDAP search. You should implement strict access control lists on sensitive objects to ensure that users can only see the information required for their specific job functions. This concept, often called minimal disclosure, limits an attacker's ability to map the landscape of your network once they gain a foothold. By treating the directory as a hardened infrastructure component rather than just a convenience for IT staff, you ensure that it remains a reliable and secure source of truth for your authorization decisions. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our exploration of modern identity systems, where we will now focus on the complexities of advanced biometric and multi-factor authentication integration. When we discuss the integration of biometric modalities such as fingerprints, iris scans, and facial recognition, we must move beyond the marketing language of high-performance sensors and focus on the mathematical constraints of the systems themselves. Every biometric implementation is essentially a statistical comparison of physical or behavioral traits against a stored reference template, which inevitably introduces the concept of the false acceptance rate and the false rejection rate. The false acceptance rate, or FAR, represents the probability that the system incorrectly authorizes an unauthorized individual, which is a critical failure in any security architecture. Conversely, the false rejection rate, or FRR, measures the frequency with which an authorized user is denied access, which directly impacts the operational friction and user experience of your system. A designer must understand that these two metrics exist in a trade-off relationship, where tightening access to reduce the FAR almost always results in a proportional increase in the FRR. You, as an architect, must define the acceptable threshold for these metrics based on the sensitivity of the resource being protected, as absolute biometric certainty is a practical impossibility in real-world deployments. Beyond physical biometrics, modern architecture increasingly relies on behavioral biometrics, which analyze patterns like keystroke dynamics, gait, or mouse movement to establish a continuous trust profile during a user session. Unlike fixed physical traits, behavioral patterns are dynamic and can be integrated into context-aware, risk-based authentication systems that evaluate risk factors at runtime. When a user requests access, a robust system does not simply check a password, but evaluates device fingerprinting, geolocation anomalies, and network velocity to adjust the authentication friction dynamically. If the system detects a user logging in from a known device at a typical time, it may remain transparent. But if the network velocity suggests a user could not have physically traveled between two access points, the system can trigger an escalation challenge. This approach shifts authentication from a static checkpoint at the entry gate to a perpetual, stateful evaluation of identity throughout the life of the connection, effectively creating a more resilient barrier against credential theft and session hijacking. To address the inherent weaknesses of traditional knowledge-based authentication, such as password fatigue or susceptibility to phishing, we must pivot toward adopting the FIDO2 and WebAuthn standards. These protocols are fundamental to moving the industry toward passwordless authentication, relying on public key cryptography to ensure that authentication is bound specifically to the domain, meaning that a credential created for one site cannot be phished for use on another. When you integrate hardware security keys or platform authenticators, the private key never leaves the secure element of the device, effectively negating the possibility of server-side database leaks compromising user credentials. This shift requires architects to design systems where the authentication protocol itself enforces cryptographically secure communication between the client's browser and the relying party. By removing the shared secret from the authentication flow, you eliminate the primary vector used in modern credential stuffing and large-scale phishing campaigns, providing a significantly higher assurance level than traditional multi-factor methods like SMS-based one-time passwords. Successfully architecting these systems requires a deep understanding of the protocols that facilitate high-assurance identity verification. See you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to explore the architectural requirements and design patterns for privileged access management systems. Privileged access management is rarely about merely changing passwords on a regular schedule. It is an architectural discipline focused on the principle of least privilege applied to the most sensitive administrative accounts. In a modern enterprise environment, the administrator is the single point of failure and the primary target for lateral movement attacks. By architecting a robust PAM system, you effectively remove persistent administrative rights from the day-to-day operations of your environment. You must conceptualize the design as a hardened security zone that acts as a gatekeeper between high-assurance infrastructure and potentially compromised network segments. Without this architectural boundary, any credential theft on a standard workstation could translate into a total domain takeover within minutes. The core objective here is to ensure that administrative sessions are isolated, ephemeral, and strictly controlled through centralized management nodes. Credential vaulting serves as the foundation for this architecture, forcing administrators to check out temporary rotated credentials rather than logging in with static, long-lived service account passwords. When designing these flows, we move away from the dangerous practice of hard-coding secrets in configuration files or scripts. Instead, we implement programmatic secrets management, where applications authenticate against a vault using identity-based lookups rather than persistent keys. Consider an automated script that requires a service account credential to run a backup procedure. Rather than saving the password in the script, the application makes a secure call to the vault, validates its own identity via a service principal, and fetches the temporary secret dynamically. This removes static credentials from the file system, thereby rendering local data leaks or backups of configuration folders harmless from an attacker's perspective. Beyond credential management, the concept of session isolation is paramount when dealing with critical infrastructure nodes. You should never permit a direct administrative connection from a standard laptop directly to a production server or a core networking component. Instead, you must architect jump hosts or privileged conduits that perform session recording and protocol inspection. These proxies terminate the administrative session at the management layer, effectively splitting the connection into two distinct pieces. This setup allows the PAM architecture to capture keystroke logs, command execution history, and even full video recordings of the session as it happens. By enforcing this midstream inspection, you create an immutable audit trail that is detached from the target system's own logging facilities. Even if an attacker gains root access to the target, they cannot alter the logs stored in the tamper-proof central vault. Just-in-time provisioning represents the current gold standard for reducing the attack surface by ensuring that access exists only when required. Rather than granting a user standing administrative privileges, the architecture should be designed to elevate rights for a specific, predetermined time window. This involves integrating your PAM solution with your corporate ticketing system or a manual approval workflow to instantiate dual authorization. Before the privileged session begins, the system verifies that a request correlates to an active, approved work order. Once the window expires, the system automatically revokes the privilege, rotates the password, and logs the closure of the task. This ensures that even if an account were compromised during a period of inactivity, there would be no associated rights for the attacker to exploit. To complete the architecture, we must address the isolation of the administrative control plane itself from general user environments. Administrative workstations should exist as separate hardened entities with no internet access and restricted monitored paths to the core infrastructure. In this design, the control plane is physically or logically segmented from the production servers and the wider corporate network. By deploying multi-factor authentication at every point of entry into the PAM vault, you ensure that even a compromised administrator identity is not sufficient to gain access. Architects must also design these systems with resiliency in mind, ensuring that the vaulting mechanism itself does not become a bottleneck that prevents emergency access to critical systems. This requires high availability and geographically redundant configurations that maintain the integrity of the audit logs even during hardware failures. I look forward to our next discussion on security architecture. Welcome back to our journey through the ISC2 ISSAP curriculum, where we focus on bridging the gap between high-level architectural requirements and the reality of software development. In this chapter, we explore how to integrate meaningful security architecture into the software development lifecycle, ensuring that defensive measures are not merely bolted on as an afterthought. We will examine how security requirements act as the foundation for the entire build process, moving from initial planning stages through to final deployment gates. By understanding how to influence the development methodology, whether it be agile, waterfall, or iterative, you will learn to bake resilience directly into the functional requirements of your systems. This approach shifts the focus from reactive patching to proactive engineering, which is the hallmark of a skilled security architect. We will discuss the orchestration of security teams alongside developers to maintain a cohesive environment where technical controls and business logic align. By the end of this module, you will be well equipped to define standardized security gating that forces adherence to your architectural vision without unnecessarily impeding velocity. The foundation of secure development begins long before a single line of code is written, specifically in the translation of business risks into clear, documented security requirements. As architects, we must facilitate a requirements traceability matrix, or RTM, which serves as the bridge between high-level policy objectives and the technical implementation specifications found in the backlog. When you define these requirements early, you provide developers with the necessary constraints that guide their choice of libraries, frameworks, and authentication mechanisms, effectively narrowing the attack surface before the design phase concludes. This documentation is not just bureaucratic overhead. It is a contract that defines what secure looks like for a specific project. If you fail to establish these clear benchmarks during the planning cycle, you forfeit the ability to enforce consistent governance later in the life cycle. Consequently, the architecture documentation must articulate these security expectations with such clarity that they become as actionable as any functional feature requested by the product owner. Threat modeling is the architectural equivalent of a stress test for our logical design, providing a systematic way to identify potential flaws before the implementation is cast in concrete. Instead of treating this as a one-time event, we must advocate for threat modeling checkpoints at every significant design iteration to ensure that as the architecture evolves, our threat landscape evolves with it. For instance, when designing a microservices-oriented interface rather than a monolithic one, the threat model must pivot from traditional perimeter defense to a model that assumes internal components are already compromised. By utilizing methodologies like STRIDE or PASTA, you force engineers to articulate how data flows through the system and where trust boundaries are violated. This creates a collaborative space where security architects can work directly with lead developers to refine the control placement. When these checkpoints are integrated into the rhythm of the development process, you reduce the necessity for last-minute architectural rework, which is often the most expensive point in a project. Integrating security into the execution phase requires us to look at the automated gates that govern transitions between development, staging, and production environments. A robust security gate acts as an automated quality control mechanism that enforces non-negotiable standards, such as the absence of critical vulnerabilities or the presence of mandatory signing headers on microservice communications. By embedding static and dynamic analysis tools directly into the continuous integration pipeline, you move the feedback loop for security defects to the moment of code committed. If these gates are configured correctly, they provide the empirical evidence required to verify compliance against the architectural design. However, it is essential to balance this rigor with the needs of the business, meaning that a developer shouldn't feel that security is an inexplicable roadblock, but rather a standard quality assurance step. Once a system passes these objective gates, we can deploy with a level of confidence that is simply impossible to achieve through manual sign-offs or informal review processes. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the architectural nuances of securing API-driven systems and microservices environments, focusing on enforcing robust security boundaries within distributed topologies. In a modern microservices architecture, the application is decomposed into smaller, autonomous services that communicate over a network, usually via REST or gRPC. Because the attack surface is distributed and the perimeter is effectively dissolved, security can no longer rely on traditional network firewalls alone. We must shift our focus to the communication layer between these services. An API gateway serves as the first line of defense, acting as a reverse proxy that sits between clients and the backend services. By centralizing entry points, the gateway allows us to enforce critical controls like rate limiting and traffic shaping, which are essential to mitigate denial of service attacks that could otherwise exhaust the resources of downstream services. Furthermore, request validation ensures that incoming payloads adhere to predefined schemas, preventing malicious data from reaching internal logic and potentially triggering injection vulnerabilities. Securing the traffic between internal services presents a distinct set of challenges, as we generally cannot trust the internal network. Mutual TLS, or MTLS, is the standard architecture for addressing this by ensuring that both the client and the server identify themselves via digital certificates before any data exchange occurs. This provides both encryption in transit and cryptographically strong authentication, effectively eliminating the risk of man-in-the-middle attacks within the cluster. Implementing MTLS manually across hundreds of services is operationally prohibitive, which leads us to the service mesh pattern. Tools like Istio or Linkerd abstract this complexity by injecting sidecar proxies into each service pod. These proxies handle the MTLS handshake, provide observability into traffic patterns, and enforce security policies consistently across the entire environment without requiring changes to the application code itself. Beyond infrastructure-level security, we must rigorously address the vulnerabilities prevalent in API design, consistently referenced by the OSP API Security Top 10. Broken Object Level Authorization, or BOLA, is arguably the most critical threat in this domain, occurring when an API fails to verify if a user has permission to access a specific resource identified by an ID in the request path. An architect must ensure that authorization logic is implemented consistently at the service level, rather than assuming that the presence of a valid session token is sufficient for accessing sensitive data. Similarly, mass assignment vulnerabilities often arise when frameworks automatically bind input from an API request directly to internal data objects. If the API model includes fields that a user should not modify, such as administrative flags or internal database identifiers, the system becomes trivial to compromise if the developer fails to explicitly whitelist input fields using data transfer objects. Proper asset management is another fundamental architectural requirement that is often overlooked in highly dynamic microservices environments. When we deploy numerous services, versions, and endpoints, maintaining a clear inventory of what is exposed to the internet is non-trivial. An obsolete, undocumented, or non-production API endpoint, often called a shadow API, can provide an attacker with an unauthenticated entry point that lacks the security controls applied to mainstream production endpoints. Consequently, we must design our CI/CD pipelines to automatically integrate into our API discovery catalogs. This ensures that every exposed route is monitored, logged, and included in our threat modeling exercises. By treating API documentation as part of the formal security architecture, we reduce the likelihood of relying on security through obscurity, which is rarely a valid strategy in distributed systems. Finally, we need to consider how our payload inspection and validation mechanisms behave under pressure. Deep packet inspection at the API gateway level can introduce latency, so it is necessary to balance rigorous inspection with performance requirements. This often involves offloading intensive validation tasks to a dedicated security layer or using hardware acceleration where appropriate. We also need to recognize that payload inspection is not a replacement for secure coding practices, but rather a final check to prevent exploitation of zero-day vulnerabilities in the application stack. When these controls are layered properly, from the gateway's validation at the edge to authenticated service-to-service communication via MTLS and strict authorization checks at the object level, we build an architecture that remains resilient even when individual components are compromised. I will see you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. In this session, we will explore the architecture of securing containerized environments and cloud-native applications, focusing on the unique challenges posed by ephemeral and distributed infrastructures. We will look beyond traditional perimeter defenses and examine the granular control required to maintain an acceptable security posture in environments like Kubernetes and serverless frameworks. Securing containerized workloads begins with the image itself, where the primary risk often stems from unpatched vulnerabilities or misconfigurations embedded within the layers of a container image. An architectural approach requires that you implement automated image scanning within your continuous integration pipelines, effectively preventing images with critical vulnerabilities from ever reaching a container registry. Furthermore, you must verify the provenance of these images using cryptographic signing mechanisms, ensuring that only trusted images are permitted to run in your production clusters. Runtime security in this context involves monitoring system calls and network behavior, as containers are often susceptible to breakout attacks if the underlying kernel is not properly isolated. By utilizing tools that enforce read-only root file systems, you significantly reduce the attack surface available to an adversary who has managed to gain execution inside a container. When architecting network security for container orchestration engines like Kubernetes, the flat nature of the default pod network often presents a significant risk to internal lateral movement. To address this, you must implement network policies that explicitly define a whitelist of allowed communication paths between pods, adhering to the principle of least privilege. This microsegmentation at the pod level effectively prevents a compromised front-end service from directly communicating with sensitive back-end database pods. In the realm of secret management, hard-coding credentials into container environment variables is an unacceptable practice because these sensitive values are often exposed in logs or management manifests. Instead, your architecture should leverage specialized secret providers or cloud-native key management services that inject secrets into the process memory at runtime, ensuring they never persist on disk or in configuration files. Serverless computing introduces a shift in the security paradigm because you no longer manage the infrastructure, which means the focus must shift entirely toward application and logic level security. Because these functions are ephemeral and trigger-based, you must implement fine-grained identity and access management models that restrict the permissions of each cloud function to its specific business requirements. An architecture that assigns a broad execution role across multiple functions is inherently risky, as a vulnerability in one function could potentially be exploited to gain unauthorized access to other cloud resources. Moreover, you need to account for event-driven attack vectors where malicious payloads might be injected through triggers such as storage events or HTTP requests, necessitating input validation and sanitization at the very early stages of the function execution. The use of open policy agents provides a robust mechanism for enforcing these security constraints, allowing you to define policies as code that automatically validate configurations against compliance benchmarks. Maintaining runtime compliance in these environments requires continuous auditing of the configuration state of your orchestration engine and cloud functions. You should design a control plane that integrates with your security operations center, facilitating the immediate alerting of configuration drift where actual settings deviate from the established security baseline. This continuous monitoring must also cover the orchestration configuration itself, as settings like administrative access to the container host or improper namespace isolation are common points of failure in cloud-native security. By decoupling the policy enforcement from the logic of the application, you create a more maintainable security architecture that remains effective, even as the number of microservices and functions grows. This approach ensures that security is baked into the immutable deployment process, rather than being applied as a reactive afterthought, which is essential for scaling secure operations in the cloud. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we explore how to strategically design and deploy web application firewalls to provide a critical defensive layer for modern web software. When we talk about web application firewalls, we're discussing a specialized application-aware filter that operates at the seventh layer of the OSI model. Unlike traditional network firewalls that primarily concern themselves with port and protocol filtering, the WAF inspects the full HTTP or HTTPS stream to identify malicious payloads. As security architects, we must decide how these engines interpret traffic, specifically choosing between signature-based detection and anomaly-based profiling. Signature-based detection relies on known attack patterns, effectively acting as a block list for common exploits. Conversely, anomaly-based profiling requires a learning phase where the BIF establishes a baseline of normal application behavior. If a request deviates significantly from this learned model, such as an unusual parameter length or unexpected character encoding, the system flags or blocks the transaction. Behavioral analysis adds a further layer of sophistication by correlating sequences of events that might indicate a slow drip attack or automated scraping. The physical or logical placement of the WAF within your network topology is perhaps your most consequential architectural decision. A reverse proxy deployment remains the classic approach, where all incoming traffic terminates at the WAF before being forwarded to the application server. This model allows the WAF to perform deep packet inspection and decryption before the request touches your backend footprint. Alternatively, you might consider a cloud-routed model, where traffic is scrubbed through a provider's global network before reaching your origin server. This offloads the computational intensity of packet inspection and provides inherent DDoS mitigation capabilities. If you are operating a highly distributed architecture, you might even consider an endpoint integrated model, such as a sidecar proxy within a service mesh. Each of these positions entails specific trade-offs regarding latency, observability, and the complexity of managing SSL or TLS decryption. Configuring rule sets to mitigate risks, such as the OWASP Top 10, requires a balance between strict security and operational utility. You must treat your WAF configuration as code, ensuring that rules are versioned and tested before being pushed to production environments. One common hurdle in this process is the management of SSL and TLS decryption loops. Because the WAF must inspect the payload to be effective, it necessarily terminates the encrypted connection, inspects the plaintext, and then re-encrypts the request to the backend. This re-encryption represents a significant overhead and introduces a potential point of failure. Architects must ensure that the performance impact of this decryption does not throttle legitimate traffic during spikes. Furthermore, handling false positives is an inevitable part of the lifecycle. Over-aggressive security policies can break legitimate application functionality, necessitating a process for tuning and exception handling. Telemetry and observability are the final pieces of an effective WAF design. A silent block is a dead end for troubleshooting, so your architecture must integrate logs into a centralized system for real-time monitoring. You want your security operations team to receive meaningful alerts when the WAF identifies a shift in traffic patterns or a mass exploitation attempt. This data should be correlated with your broader system logs to provide a holistic view of the threat landscape. When you are dealing with massive traffic volume, you must also plan for horizontal scaling so that the inspection engine itself does not become a bottleneck. By ensuring that your WAF is both properly positioned and continuously monitored, you create a robust perimeter that actively defends your applications against evolving web-based threats. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Let us explore the critical components of data security architecture directly within the application layers. We will specifically focus on how to maintain data integrity and confidentiality despite potential infrastructure-level breaches. When we design applications, we often rely on infrastructure security to protect our data, but a truly resilient architecture assumes that the infrastructure is eventually compromised. Architecting for data security within the application means we treat the database not as a trusted fortress, but as a storage medium that requires its own security controls. Secure storage patterns generally start by moving away from clear text storage and toward a model where encryption begins at the application layer. By employing field-level database encryption, we ensure that sensitive fields like social security numbers or private health information are encrypted before they ever reach the database driver. This approach significantly reduces the blast radius if an attacker gains unauthorized access to the database logs or backups directly, as the decrypted data simply does not exist outside the protected scope of the application service. Dynamic data masking presents a compelling alternative for scenarios where full encryption is not necessary, but exposure must be limited based on the user's role. Instead of decrypting the entire data record, the application implements logic to redact or obfuscate specific parts of the output, such as showing only the last 4 digits of a credit card number to a customer service representative. This is starkly different from tokenization, which replaces sensitive data elements with non-sensitive substitutes called tokens. In a well-designed tokenization system, the original data is stored in a secure, centralized vault, while the application only interacts with the tokenized version. This effectively isolates the sensitive information from the application logic, making it much harder for an attacker to perform mass data exfiltration even if they successfully exploit an application vulnerability. Injection vulnerabilities remain a persistent threat, and mitigating them requires a disciplined application of input validation and output encoding libraries. Many developers fall into the trap of using blacklisting, where they try to filter out known bad input, but this is fundamentally flawed because an attacker can almost always find a way around a manual list. The correct architectural pattern is allow listing, where we strictly define the expected input format for every field, rejecting anything that does not conform to the predefined rules. When it comes to outputting this data, we must ensure it is contextually encoded for the specific medium, such as HTML or JavaScript, to prevent script execution by a malicious actor. By moving these concerns into standardized secure libraries, we ensure that developers do not have to reinvent the wheel, and we maintain a consistent security posture across the entire application ecosystem. Session management and caching represent the final, often overlooked pillars of robust application data security. When we store session state, we must ensure that cookies are protected with flags like secure, HTTP only, and same site to prevent tampering and cross-site scripting risks. Furthermore, a secure caching architecture requires us to consider what data is being cached in memory or on the file system, as this can easily become a side channel for sensitive information leakage. Data must be encrypted before being placed in a shared cache, especially in distributed environments where multiple application instances might access the same Redis or Memcache cluster. Architects must design these data flows intentionally, ensuring that at no point does the application surface unencrypted sensitive data to a layer that is outside of its implicit trust boundary. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the enterprise lifecycle of cryptographic keys and how to engineer robust management systems. Cryptographic security is rarely about the strength of the algorithm itself, which we often assume is sufficient, but rather about the management of the keys that make those algorithms useful. If you look at NIST SP 800-57, you will find a formalization of the key lifecycle that begins at generation and ends only when the key is securely destroyed. Generation is perhaps the most critical stage because a key is only as strong as its entropy. If the random number generator is flawed or predictable, the entire architecture becomes a house of cards. You must ensure that keys are generated within a hardware security module, or HSM, rather than in generic application memory, as the latter exposes the key to processes or actors that have no business interacting with cryptographic material. Once generated, the storage mechanism must guarantee both confidentiality and integrity, meaning the key should be encrypted at rest even within its secure container, often using a master key or key encryption key. Distribution is equally perilous, as transmitting keys across a network requires a secure channel that is often established using asymmetric encryption, effectively creating a chicken and egg problem regarding initial trust. The architecture of your key management system, or KMS, must incorporate the principles of split knowledge and dual control to mitigate the risk of a single malicious insider. Split knowledge implies that no single individual possesses enough information to reconstruct a key, as the key material is fragmented among multiple stakeholders. Dual control requires that at least two people must authorize any significant operation, such as key rotation or emergency revocation, effectively preventing unauthorized unilateral actions. This is why you should avoid storing keys in hard-coded configuration files or environment variables where they might inadvertently end up in version control systems or log files. Instead, your architecture should leverage an external KMS where the application code never actually sees the master key. It instead sends data to the service for encryption or decryption. This decoupling is essential, as it enforces a clear separation of duties between the infrastructure that hosts the application logic and the security infrastructure that governs the policy of the keys themselves. Rotation is another area where many teams struggle, often opting for static keys that remain in use for years, which drastically increases the blast radius should a compromise occur. An effective architectural design implements automated rotation schedules where the system gracefully handles versioning, allowing old data to be decrypted with previous keys while new data is encrypted with current ones. This requires you to design key derivation functions that allow for the efficient generation of subkeys from a master secret without rekeying the entire underlying database. If you are working in a cloud-native environment, native KMS solutions provide these rotation capabilities as a managed service, handling the underlying hardware complexity for you while providing an audit trail that shows exactly who accessed or used a key and when. Your policy must also plan for the emergency revocation, which is a state where a key is marked as compromised and must be immediately excluded from all crypto operations, sometimes forcing a system-wide re-encryption of data. Archiving and destruction represent the often overlooked bookends of the key management lifecycle. Archiving is not merely a backup, but a structured process that ensures you can recover encrypted historical data years from now, provided you maintain the necessary metadata about which keys were used for which datasets. Destruction, conversely, must be absolute, ensuring that the key material is zeroized or sanitized in a way that renders it physically unrecoverable from the storage medium. This is especially challenging in virtualized or cloud environments where underlying hardware is abstracted, so you must rely on provider-guaranteed destruction certificates or software-level zeroization commands. Ultimately, your KMS architecture must act as a source of truth that is isolated from the application logic layers while remaining accessible through strictly defined APIs. By ensuring that your key management system is centralized, audited, and automated, you reduce the potential for human error and ensure that your cryptographic controls provide meaningful assurance. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to our exploration of public key infrastructure design within the enterprise. We are going to examine the architectural requirements for building a robust and scalable trust ecosystem. Building a public key infrastructure, or PKI, is fundamentally about establishing a reliable framework for identity and trust across an organization. When we design a PKI, we are not simply setting up software or generating keys to encrypt traffic. We are building a system that underpins the entire security posture of the enterprise, enabling digital signatures, persistent authentication, and widespread encryption. The architecture must be carefully structured to ensure that the chain of trust remains unbroken, which usually mandates a multi-tier hierarchy. In this design, the root certificate authority acts as the trust anchor, kept offline and protected by the most stringent physical and logical controls, while issuing certificates to subordinate or intermediate CAs. These intermediate CAs then handle the operational burden of issuing certificates to end entities, providing a necessary layer of isolation that protects the root key from common operational exposures. Once the hierarchical structure is defined, we must consider the lifecycle management of the certificates themselves. An enterprise PKI is dynamic, with certificates constantly nearing expiration or requiring revocation. Manual management at scale is impossible and inherently prone to human error, which is why we must integrate automation protocols like the Automated Certificate Management Environment or the Simple Certificate Enrollment Protocol. These protocols allow services to request, renew, and install certificates with minimal administrative intervention, reducing the risk of outages caused by expired certificates. Furthermore, the architecture must account for the rigorous documentation of governance through the certificate policy and the certification practice statement. The certificate policy outlines the business requirements and the degree of assurance needed for various certificate types, whereas the certification practice statement details the operational and technical procedures used to manage the certificates in accordance with those policies. Revocation is often the most overlooked part of PKI design until an incident forces the issue, yet it remains absolutely critical to the system's integrity. When a private key is compromised or a user leaves the organization, the associated certificate must be invalidated before its natural expiry. Traditionally, companies relied on certificate revocation lists, which are files signed by the CA containing serial numbers of revoked certificates that clients periodically download. However, as the number of certificates grows, these lists can become prohibitively large, leading to significant latency in certificate validation. To solve this, we often implement the Online Certificate Status Protocol, which allows for real-time verification of a specific certificate status. When we further optimize this with OCSP stapling, the server itself fetches the signed, timestamped status from the CA and presents it to the client during the TLS handshake, effectively removing the need for the client to contact the CA and improving both privacy and performance. Securing the CA itself requires a defense-in-depth approach that extends beyond standard network security. Because the CA possesses the ability to sign any identity, it is the ultimate target for an adversary, necessitating hardware security modules to protect private keys. These modules must be validated for physical tamper resistance and should be configured to prevent the extraction of the private key in plain text under any circumstances. Logical access must follow the principle of least privilege, typically requiring multi-party control, or M of N quorum, for any administrative action that involves the root or critical intermediate signing keys. This ensures that no single individual has the capability to subvert or misuse the foundation of the entire enterprise trust model, maintaining the sanctity of the certificate hierarchy even in the face of sophisticated intrusion attempts. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will focus on the practical application of symmetric and asymmetric cryptographic algorithms within modern enterprise systems. Cryptography is often misunderstood as a monolithic concept, but in practice, it is a collection of specific tools designed for distinct roles. Symmetric algorithms, such as the Advanced Encryption Standard or the newer CISSP, operate on the premise that the same secret key is used for both encryption and decryption. Because these operations are computationally efficient, they are the workhorses for bulk data encapsulation, the kind we use when securing large databases or streaming high-bandwidth traffic. However, symmetric ciphers require a secure channel to distribute the secret key, which creates a classic chicken and egg problem in network design. To manage how these blocks are processed, we utilize modes of operation like cipher block chaining or the more modern Galois/counter mode. GCM is particularly valuable in high-performance environments because it provides both confidentiality and data origin authentication, effectively combining encryption with an integrity check. If you find yourself designing a system that transmits gigabytes of data, your architecture should ideally rely on symmetric encryption to keep latency low and throughput high. Asymmetric cryptography, or public key cryptography, addresses the key distribution challenge by using a mathematically linked pair of keys, a public key for encryption and a private key for decryption. Algorithms like RSA rely on the computational difficulty of factoring large prime numbers, which historically required significantly larger key sizes to maintain security compared to symmetric standards. Elliptic curve cryptography has changed this dynamic by providing equivalent security strength with much smaller key lengths, leading to superior computational efficiency and reduced storage overhead for keys. Despite these advancements, asymmetric operations are still orders of magnitude slower than their symmetric counterparts because they involve complex modular exponentiation or point multiplication on an elliptic curve. For this reason, you should never attempt to encrypt a large file directly using RSA or ECC. Instead, your architectural design should treat asymmetric primitives as the mechanism for establishing trust or performing a secure key exchange, leaving the heavy lifting of data encryption to symmetric algorithms. The most robust architectural pattern is the hybrid encryption model, which combines the best traits of both worlds into a single, cohesive workflow. In a typical implementation, such as the initial handshake of a transport layer security session, the two parties use an asymmetric algorithm to perform a key exchange. Once an ephemeral symmetric key is securely negotiated between the client and the server, the asymmetric infrastructure steps aside. The remainder of the session transitions to symmetric encryption, allowing the system to maintain high performance while enjoying the benefits of keys that were never exposed during the negotiation. This design effectively mitigates the risks associated with long-term key compromise, as the session keys are unique and transient. When you evaluate these technologies for your architecture, always look beyond the algorithm itself and consider how the key lifecycle interacts with the rest of your security stack. Ultimately, your goal is to minimize the exposure window of sensitive secrets while ensuring the system remains responsive under load. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our journey through the cryptographic architecture domain. Today, we will focus on architecting robust protections for data residing on storage systems and data moving across network boundaries. When we talk about data at rest, we are primarily concerned with mitigating the risk of physical theft of storage media or unauthorized access to file systems. Full disk encryption, or FDE, serves as our baseline defense by encrypting the entire drive, which ensures that data remains opaque even if the hardware is removed or disposed of improperly. However, FDE is transparent to the operating system after the initial boot, meaning that once the system is live, any user or process with sufficient privileges can access the plain text. This is why we often layer folder-level or file-level encryption to provide more granular, identity-based access controls that persist beyond the initial boot sequence. For database environments, transparent data encryption offers a sophisticated approach by encrypting database files, log files, and backups at the database engine level. This approach protects against file-level attacks without requiring application-level code changes, provided that the underlying key management architecture is secure and correctly segmented from the data itself. Transitioning to data in transit, the architecture must ensure confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity across potentially untrusted network segments. TLS 1.3 is currently the gold standard, as it streamlines the handshake process and forcibly removes obsolete, insecure cryptographic primitives that plagued older versions like SSL or TLS 1.0. When designing for TLS, you must consciously select cipher suites that support authenticated encryption with associated data, such as AES-GCM, which provides both confidentiality and integrity in a single pass. Perfect. Forward secrecy is a critical requirement in any modern architecture, as it guarantees that a compromise of the long-term server private key does not lead to the retrospective decryption of past sessions. By mandating ephemeral key exchanges, such as elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, we provide a mathematical guarantee that every session key is unique and non-persistent. Architecture for secure movement across internal and external backbones often requires the implementation of IPsec to provide network layer security. Unlike TLS, which operates at the application level, IPsec functions at the network layer, wrapping the entire IP packet and making it an ideal choice for site-to-site connectivity or secure tunneling between heterogeneous systems. When configuring IPsec, the design decision rests primarily between transport mode for host-to-host communication and tunnel mode for gateway-to-gateway scenarios. Always prioritize the use of ISC2 for key exchange, as it offers superior resilience to congestion and more robust authentication methods compared to its predecessor. For administrative access, the Secure Shell protocol remains indispensable, provided that we disable legacy features like password-based authentication in favor of public key infrastructure-backed identity verification. Designing these channels requires a disciplined approach to eliminating weak configurations, which are often the weakest link in an otherwise strong crypto architecture. You must explicitly disable support for null ciphers, low-bit depth keys, and deprecated hashing algorithms like MD5 or SHA-1 within your global configuration profiles. This creates a standardized base for your enterprise systems, ensuring that even if an administrator manually configures a service, the default state remains resistant to downgrade attacks. Furthermore, internal enterprise backbones should not be considered inherently trusted, which necessitates the use of mutual authentication across all transit channels, regardless of whether the traffic stays on the local area network. By treating every segment as untrusted, you enforce a consistent security posture that simplifies auditing and reduces the complexity of managing disparate security policies across the network topology. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to our investigation into the cryptographic paradigms necessitated by the rise of quantum computing. We will define the architectural requirements for transitioning to quantum-resistant standards. The threat landscape for modern cryptography has fundamentally shifted due to the theoretical development of quantum algorithms. Specifically, Shor's algorithm poses an existential threat to current public key infrastructure by efficiently solving the integer factorization and discrete logarithm problems. If a sufficiently powerful cryptographically relevant quantum computer were realized, common standards like RSA, ECDSA, and Diffie-Hellman would become effectively obsolete. While many assume these systems are safe for the time being, the harvest now, decrypt later attack vector necessitates action today for long-term data security. This means that data encrypted now and intercepted by an adversary could be decrypted once quantum hardware matures to the required threshold. Consequently, we must approach our architecture not merely as a reflection of current computational constraints, but as a hedge against future decryption capabilities. Grover's algorithm presents a different, albeit less catastrophic, challenge for symmetric cryptography. It provides a quadratic speedup for searching unstructured databases, which effectively reduces the security strength of symmetric keys by half. For instance, AES-128, which provides 128 bits of security against classical attacks, would provide only 64 bits of security against a quantum adversary using Grover's algorithm. For an architect, the mitigation strategy here is relatively straightforward. We should standardize on higher key lengths, specifically moving toward AES-256 for all critical data at rest and in transit. While symmetric algorithms are generally considered more resilient than their asymmetric counterparts, neglecting to increase key sizes creates an avoidable vulnerability in our long-term threat model. To address the threat to public key systems, NIST has been leading the global effort to standardize post-quantum cryptographic primitives. These new algorithms rely on mathematical problems that are currently believed to be resistant to both classical and quantum computing approaches. The leading candidates fall into several families, most notably lattice-based, code-based, and multivariate cryptography. Lattice-based cryptography, such as the Crystal's Kyber key encapsulation mechanism, is currently favored for its efficiency and relatively small key sizes, making it a strong candidate for key exchange protocols. Conversely, code-based cryptography, which builds upon the difficulty of decoding general linear codes, has a longer history of study, though it often involves larger public keys that may complicate network packet transmission. The core challenge for an enterprise architect is not just selecting a new algorithm, but building systems that can handle the transition process. We refer to this design quality as cryptographic agility, which implies that our systems should be able to switch between primitives without requiring a complete rewrite of the application logic. Hard-coding a specific cryptographic implementation into the application core is a recipe for technical debt and security fatigue during the inevitable migration cycles of the next decade. Instead, we should favor service-oriented designs where cryptographic providers are decoupled from the business logic through abstraction layers. This allows us to update the underlying library or algorithm as new standards emerge, or as current ones are scrutinized by the academic community. A practical transition strategy that we can deploy today involves the implementation of hybrid cryptographic schemes. These schemes wrap a classical algorithm, such as ECDH, together with a post-quantum algorithm into a single key exchange process. By performing both exchanges in parallel, the session key is derived from the concatenation of the results from both pathways, ensuring that the connection remains secure as long as at least one of the underlying algorithms is robust. If the post-quantum algorithm were found to have a fundamental flaw, the security reverts to the current classical state, but we gain the benefit of quantum resistance immediately. This hybrid approach significantly reduces the risk of adopting relatively young, unproven post-quantum primitives while providing immediate protection against harvesting. As we look at long-term data archival, the design considerations become even more critical than those for ephemeral network sessions. Data stored in archives must remain confidential for decades, potentially spanning the timeline when quantum computers become production-ready. We must mandate that the architectural design of our storage systems supports the future rotation of quantum-resistant signatures and encryption, even for data that is currently encrypted with classical keys. This requires careful metadata management and versioning of our cryptographic primitives to ensure that we maintain the integrity and confidentiality of the data throughout the migration lifecycle. The goal is to avoid a scenario where the cost of re-encrypting petabytes of historical data becomes a barrier to necessary security evolution. Our focus as architects must remain on the integration of these primitives into existing security frameworks and identity models without disrupting established business workflows. We should advocate for protocols that are already beginning to support negotiation of hybrid key exchanges, such as updated versions of TLS. By influencing vendor selection and infrastructure standards now, we can ensure that our enterprise security posture is not left relying on outdated mathematical foundations when the quantum transition accelerates. Planning for algorithm transitions is a governance activity as much as an engineering one, requiring clear documentation of where and why specific cryptographic implementations are utilized. We are essentially building the capability to change the foundation of our security architecture while the house is still occupied and running. I look forward to discussing the next section with you. Welcome to our exploration of cryptographic integrity, where we will dissect the mechanical underpinnings of hashing and digital signatures. Integrity serves as a fundamental pillar in architecture, ensuring that data arriving at a destination is identical to the data sent by the source. While encryption provides confidentiality, integrity controls like hash functions allow us to map arbitrary length inputs to fixed size outputs, effectively creating a digest or a digital fingerprint. When we talk about these functions, we are essentially looking for one-way properties where reversing the computation is computationally infeasible. Beyond simple one-way properties, we require collision resistance, meaning it should be incredibly difficult to find two distinct inputs that produce the same digest. If a system allows for easy collisions, an attacker could replace a legitimate binary with a malicious one while maintaining the same hash value, rendering the entire integrity control useless. Modern architectural standards have largely migrated away from legacy families like MD5 and SHA-1 due to documented vulnerabilities and successful collision attacks. Today, we prioritize the SHA-2 family, specifically SHA-256 and SHA-512, which provide a robust security margin for most commercial applications. However, the industry has also adopted SHA-3, based on the KECAC construction, which offers a different internal architecture that is resistant to the length extension attacks that occasionally plague the Merkle-Damgård construction of SHA-2. Furthermore, designers are increasingly evaluating Blake, specifically Blake 2 and Blake 3, due to their impressive performance profile compared to the NIST standards. Choosing the right algorithm is not just about raw security. It is about balancing the computational overhead against the specific threat model of your architecture. While hashes ensure that content has not been tampered with, they do not inherently prove the identity of the sender, which is where message authentication codes, or MACs, come into play. A MAC combines a cryptographic hash with a secret key, ensuring that only parties possessing that key can generate or verify the digest. Architects frequently utilize hash-based message authentication codes, or HMACs, to secure APIs and internal service communication. By binding the integrity check to a secret, you effectively prevent an adversary from simply swapping the data and recalculating a new hash digest. Proper HMAC implementation requires careful key management, as the security of the integrity control is entirely dependent on the secrecy and entropy of the key material used in the construction. Moving into the realm of non-repudiation, we rely on digital signatures, which leverage asymmetric cryptography rather than symmetric keys. In this workflow, the signer uses a private key to create a digital signature over a hash of the data, which any recipient can verify using the corresponding public key. This mechanism is critical for code signing pipelines and legal document exchanges because it provides definitive proof of origin that cannot be easily disavowed by the signer. When designing these systems, I prefer newer elliptic curve constructions such as ECDSA or ED25519 rather than traditional RSA signatures. ED25519 specifically is designed with security by default principles, making it less prone to implementation errors such as side-channel leakage or insecure nonce generation, which have historically compromised other signature architectures. In an architecture where high-volume transactional data must be verified, the performance of your integrity controls becomes a critical system design constraint. Every compute cycle spent verifying signatures or computing HMACs adds latency, which can aggregate in a microservices environment where a single request may trigger several verification points. You must consider the placement of signature verification within your processing pipeline to ensure it does not become a bottleneck that limits system throughput. Furthermore, if your architecture involves long-term data storage, you must account for the natural decay of cryptographic strength. This brings into play the necessity for re-signing policies, where data is periodically revalidated using current standards to protect against future advances in cryptanalysis or the inevitable increase in available computing power. Ultimately, integrity is not merely a checkbox on a compliance document, but a design pattern that must be woven into the fabric of your data transit flows. Whether securing a CI/CD pipeline against remote code execution or validating the provenance of firmware updates for IoT devices, the combination of hashing, MACs, and signatures forms the bedrock of trust. You are building systems where the receiver can be mathematically certain of the source and the accuracy of the payload. Always treat your integrity verification layer as an immutable part of your system constraints, ensuring it is tested under both load and failure conditions. As architects, our goal is to eliminate ambiguity in data exchange, ensuring that our security posture remains resilient regardless of the adversarial environment. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back to the course, where we bridge the gap between abstract security strategy and the functional, high-pressure environment of the Security Operations Center. In this session, we will dissect the structural blueprints required to build a resilient SOC architecture capable of addressing modern enterprise threats. Building a functional security operations center is not merely about purchasing a suite of tools. It is an exercise in organizational design and data governance. When evaluating a centralized SOC model, you establish a single point of truth where all telemetry converges, which simplifies oversight but risks creating a critical bottleneck during massive data spikes or enterprise expansion. Conversely, a distributed model pushes monitoring closer to regional business units, which can improve local responsiveness and compliance with data residency laws. Yet, it complicates the development of a unified security posture. Hybrid approaches attempt to balance these concerns by centralizing core analytical functions while delegating localized incident handling to regional teams. Your choice must be dictated by your specific resource constraints, the geographical footprint of the company, and the maturity of your current threat intelligence capabilities. Each model carries inherent trade-offs in terms of staffing redundancy and the ability to maintain a consistent standard of operational excellence across all shifts. Once you decide on an organizational structure, you must architect the data ingestion paths that feed your central nervous system. A well-designed ingestion pipeline employs a tiered approach, where logs are filtered, enriched, and normalized at the point of origin or a regional collector before reaching the primary analysis layer. This prevents the consumption of excessive bandwidth and ensures that your SIEM is not overwhelmed by unindexed noise, which is a common failure state in rapidly growing environments. You should evaluate your data flows against the specific requirements of your tier-based analyst workflows to ensure that junior analysts have immediate access to contextualized alerts, while Tier 3 researchers retain broader, raw access for deep forensic investigation. This design also necessitates the establishment of clear service-level agreements, which define the expected response and resolution times for varying threat severity levels. If your SLAs remain amorphous, you will find it impossible to measure or improve the efficacy of your incident response process over time. Beyond software and data, the physical and logical architecture of the SOC requires a focus on isolation and high availability infrastructure. The monitoring tools themselves must reside within a hardened, segmented network environment to prevent lateral movement from compromised assets into the very systems you use to defend the enterprise. Think of the SOC as the command bunker. If the bunker security is weaker than the perimeter it protects, the entire operation is compromised. Consequently, you must integrate threat hunting frameworks, such as the MITRE ATT and CK methodology, directly into the SOC monitoring design to ensure that you are not just reacting to known signatures, but actively searching for indicators of compromise. This requires a scalable architecture where infrastructure can grow alongside data volume without degrading service quality. By standardizing these architectural frameworks, you create a sustainable foundation that turns the SOC from a chaotic reactive bucket into a proactive, strategic asset for the business. I look forward to our next discussion. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the technical architecture of SIEM systems and the requirements for scalable enterprise log management. Building an effective security information and event management architecture requires moving beyond simple log collection to creating a data pipeline capable of handling massive telemetry throughput. At the architectural level, you must treat your SIEM not as a monolithic box, but as a distributed system consisting of forwarders, aggregators, and storage backends. Forwarders should reside as close to the telemetry source as possible, performing local buffering and minimal filtering to reduce network congestion before sending data to an aggregator. Aggregators function as intermediate processing nodes, where you normalize disparate data formats into a common schema, such as the Elastic Common Schema or Splunk's CIA. Without this normalization step, writing correlation rules becomes an exercise in frustration because your logic would need to account for every vendor-specific variation of a login event. Parsing telemetry at the aggregator level is essential, as it offloads the CPU burden from the core analytics engine and ensures that data arriving at the indexer is already searchable and structured. Designing for scale means you must implement a data lifecycle management strategy that balances hot, cold, and frozen storage tiers. Hot storage needs to support high-ops operations for real-time alerting and dashboarding, which is why it often relies on expensive flash storage arrays. Cold storage, conversely, utilizes lower-cost object storage or dense high-capacity disk tiers, which is appropriate for data that is rarely accessed but must be retained for regulatory compliance or historical forensic analysis. An architect must determine the appropriate retention period for each log type based on risk exposure and compliance mandates, rather than simply keeping everything until the storage volume fills up. This storage hierarchy is critical for controlling licensing costs, which are frequently driven by ingestion volumes in many commercial SIEM platforms. By filtering out non-actionable noise, such as debug logs or repetitive informational netflow packets, at the forwarder level, you lower your ingestion footprint and optimize your long-term storage spend. Correlation rules and alerting represent the intelligence layer of your SIEM architecture, but they are often the biggest source of operational friction. Excessive false positives often stem from poorly defined logic that fails to account for environmental context, such as scheduled vulnerability scans or routine administrative automated tasks. When you design correlation rules, prioritize high-fidelity indicators over broad heuristic patterns, as the former reduces alert fatigue among SOC personnel. You should implement automated suppression mechanics that suppress subsequent alerts from the same source for a defined time window, preventing a single compromised host from flooding the console. Furthermore, ensure your architecture integrates with external threat intelligence feeds to enrich logs during the ingestion phase, giving analysts crucial context, such as known malicious IP addresses or domain reputation scores immediately upon alert generation. In cloud and hybrid environments, the architectural challenge expands to include container logs, VPC flow logs, and management plane activity logs, which exhibit high velocity and volume. You cannot rely on traditional syslog mechanisms alone. You must leverage native cloud telemetry pipelines like AWS CloudWatch or Azure Monitor to aggregate events before piping them into your SIEM. These native services often provide cost-effective pre-processing capabilities that can drop irrelevant events, further reducing the load on your primary architecture. For application logs, consider implementing structured logging standards throughout your development lifecycle, forcing developers to output logs in JSON, which is far easier for parsers to ingest than unstructured text. Your success as an architect hinges on ensuring that the telemetry is not only collected and stored, but is actually useful for identifying genuine security incidents within your specific threat landscape. See you in our next technical discussion. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the integration of security orchestration, automation, and response, commonly known as SOAR, into your enterprise incident response lifecycle. When we approach incident response from an architectural perspective, the goal is largely to reduce the mean time to respond by removing human latency from repetitive tasks. Traditional incident response often relies on manual playbooks, where an analyst receives an alert from a security information and event management system, manually queries threat intelligence for context, and then hops into an identity management console to disable a compromised account. This process is inherently slow and prone to inconsistency, especially when the volume of security alerts exceeds the cognitive bandwidth of human operators. By architecting a source solution, we transition these manual procedures into machine-readable workflows that connect discrete systems together. A well-designed workflow might start with a SIEM indicator, query a threat intelligence provider to score the event, and based on a predefined threshold, automatically trigger a blocking rule on a perimeter firewall or isolate an endpoint via an EDR agent. Designing these integrations requires a deep understanding of how your security components communicate via APIs, as the efficiency of your automation depends entirely on the stability of these interfaces. You must think about your infrastructure as a series of connected services rather than a collection of standalone appliances that require manual configuration. For instance, consider an alert involving a suspicious outbound connection from a laboratory workstation. Instead of just notifying an analyst, your SOAR platform can automatically cross-reference the internal IP address with your identity system to identify the owner. Check your configuration management database to verify the asset's function, and pull the recent file integrity monitoring logs. This orchestration layer acts as the glue that transforms disparate logs into structured, actionable intelligence. It forces you to document the exact logic behind your security operations, which is a significant architectural benefit in its own right because it eliminates latent tribal knowledge within the SOC team. However, the power of automation brings the risk of cascading failures, necessitating clearly defined automation boundaries. Not every action should be fully automated, as the risk of a false positive leading to a disruptive, large-scale service outage is often too high for business-critical infrastructure. You need to architect a control plane that distinguishes between low-risk remediations, like adding an IP to a block list, and high-risk actions, such as shutting down a production-facing server or revoking administrative access across an entire organizational unit. For high-risk actions, the standard design pattern is to automate the data collection and the synthesis of the incident report, but insert a mandatory wait state for human authorization. This hybrid approach ensures that the human operator acts as the final gatekeeper for irreversible or highly impactful actions, while the automation does the heavy lifting of information gathering and preparation. Operational safety is the primary constraint when you are designing these automated feedback loops, so you must account for failure modes in your architecture. If an automated script fails because an API is unreachable or a service is down, your architecture must ensure the incident is safely returned to a human queue rather than being silently dropped or stuck in a zombie state. Furthermore, you should implement rate limiting and item potency controls within your playbooks to prevent a flood of automated remediations from overwhelming your core systems. If a specific threat actor triggers a widespread event, your SOAR platform might otherwise attempt to block thousands of IP addresses simultaneously, potentially destabilizing your firewall's performance if it is not designed to handle high-velocity updates. By carefully partitioning the automated and manual segments of your playbooks, you maintain a level of operational agility that is consistent with the demands of modern, machine-speed security threats. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back. Today, we are diving into the architecture of threat intelligence platform integration. We will explore how to ingest, normalize, and operationalize intelligence to shift your security posture from reactive to proactive. In any modern security operations architecture, a threat intelligence platform serves as the central nervous system for external situational awareness. When you integrate a platform of this nature, the primary technical challenge is the ingestion and normalization of data from disparate sources. Commercial feeds often provide high-fidelity, curated intelligence, while open-source intelligence provides a broader, albeit noisier dataset. You must handle both through standardized protocols such as TAXI to transport intelligence, while utilizing data formats like sticks to describe the structures of cyber threats. By normalizing these inputs, the system ensures that different security tools understand the context of the incoming data, whether it concerns a specific file hash or a complex campaign technique. This canonical representation is the foundational step that allows your architecture to move beyond simple data aggregation into meaningful, machine-readable intelligence. Once you have established a reliable pipeline for intelligence, the focus must shift toward operationalization through deep integration with your SIEM, SOAR, and endpoint ecosystems. A threat intelligence platform is not merely a repository. It is an active participant in your defensive lifecycle. For instance, you should configure your platform to automatically push high-confidence indicators of compromise directly to your SIEM for correlation against historical logs. Similarly, integrating with a SOAR allows your security team to trigger automated workflows whenever a new verified threat actor technique is identified. If your feed indicates a shift in adversary tactics towards specific exploitation vectors, these platforms can dynamically update firewall block lists or email filtering policies before any actual impact occurs. This architectural feedback loop effectively transforms your defensive capabilities from a static model into one that evolves alongside the global threat landscape. Designing this integration requires a careful balance between the breadth of data and the signal-to-noise ratio within your security stack. If you feed every indicator into your production systems, you will inevitably experience significant performance degradation or, worse, an overwhelming influx of false positives. You should implement rigorous filtering policies within your threat intelligence platform to ensure that only the most relevant, context-aware information reaches your operational tools. For example, a global network block list that is not filtered against your current infrastructure assets will likely cause more operational disruption than security value. By applying metadata tagging to incoming intelligence, you can architect automated rules that only push alerts or blocks related to environments you actually own. This precise orchestration ensures that the infrastructure remains resilient while maintaining a posture of active, intelligent defense. Ultimately, the goal of integrating threat intelligence into your security architecture is to shorten the window between detection and mitigation. When you treat indicators as transient, dynamic data points rather than hard-coded constants, you increase the cost of operation for the threat actor. Consider the case of tactical updates. An intelligent architecture can ingest data regarding a newly observed command and control IP and propagate it globally across all sensors within minutes. This capability is only possible when the integration points between the threat intelligence platform and the enforcement layers, such as firewalls, proxies, and endpoint agents, are tightly coupled via automated orchestration. By embracing this approach, the professional architect ensures that security is not just a passive monitor of events, but an adaptive system capable of real-time defensive adjustments. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are now moving into the design of continuous monitoring and logging architectures within complex, distributed environments. In an era where the perimeter has effectively dissolved, the effectiveness of your security posture hinges entirely on your visibility. We are no longer talking about static log collection at the edge, but rather a holistic framework that aggregates telemetry across cloud workloads, on-premises data centers, and the disparate devices utilized by a remote workforce. The objective is to design a monitoring ecosystem that minimizes blind spots without inundating your operations team with low-fidelity noise. We achieve this by integrating endpoint detection and response, or EDR, alongside extended detection and response, commonly known as XDR, which allows for cross-layered investigation. Furthermore, incorporating network traffic analysis enables us to correlate behavioral anomalies observed at the network layer with specific process executions on endpoints. When designing these systems, you must consider the trade-offs between telemetry granularity and the resultant performance overhead on the host systems. Data minimization serves as a core architectural constraint in modern monitoring strategies. Collecting every event emitted by an operating system is rarely feasible or even desirable due to storage costs and the signal-to-noise ratio. Instead, you need to architect a pipeline that performs intelligent filtering and aggregation as close to the source as possible. This approach forces us to define what constitutes actionable telemetry for various asset types, such as differentiating between the logging requirements of a production database and a stateless container. By applying structured logging formats at the source, we simplify the ingestion process for downstream analytical tools like a SIM. This architectural discipline ensures that when a security incident occurs, the relevant breadcrumbs are already present within your centralized repository. Without this upfront design, you will inevitably find yourself lacking the specific evidence required for a forensic investigation after a breach has occurred. Security of the logging infrastructure itself is often an overlooked aspect of the architectural design process. Advanced threat actors understand that if they can compromise the logs, they can hide their activities or manipulate their footprint to mislead investigators. Consequently, you must implement secure and encrypted channels for all log transportation to prevent interception or injection of malicious data packets during transit. Once data reaches the collector, it is imperative to apply cryptographic integrity checks and append-only immutability postures to the storage layer. By utilizing digital signatures on log bundles, you ensure that any unauthorized modification or deletion performed by a malicious actor can be detected during routine integrity audits. In your capacity as an architect, you must treat the logging system with the same level of security rigor as you would a critical production database, recognizing its function as the ultimate source of truth for your organizational security status. See you in our next session. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will focus on the architectural principles behind architecting enterprise-wide disaster recovery and business continuity solutions. Architecting for resilience begins with a clear understanding of the business requirements derived from a formal business impact analysis. As an architect, you cannot simply deploy redundant servers and call it a strategy. You must first quantify the maximum tolerable downtime of each business process. This analysis produces two critical metrics: the recovery time objective, which defines the duration for service restoration, and the recovery point objective, which defines the acceptable threshold for data loss. Your design choices regarding infrastructure availability must be directly traceable to these objectives to avoid the common pitfall of over-investing in high-availability solutions for low-criticality systems. When you draft these requirements, maintain a clear distinction between the business process recovery time and the underlying technical system restoration time. Once your recovery objectives are established, the physical or logical architecture of your recovery sites becomes the next focal point. Designing a disaster recovery site requires choosing between hot, warm, and cold configurations based on cost, complexity, and the defined RTO. A hot site is fully operational and synchronized in real time, providing near zero failover time, but at a significant infrastructure cost. A warm site maintains the necessary hardware and data, but requires manual or semi-automated configuration to bring critical services online, effectively balancing cost with a moderate recovery duration. A cold site, conversely, represents a minimal investment in infrastructure, requiring the physical transport of equipment or the manual provisioning of cloud environments, which is usually only acceptable for non-critical business functions. Your architectural decisions here must be vetted against the budget and the organization's appetite for potential downtime during a declared crisis event. Data replication and failover orchestration demand a rigorous approach to software-defined availability, often leveraging asynchronous or synchronous replication patterns. Synchronous replication ensures data integrity by preventing transaction completion until the standby site confirms the right, yet it is often limited by physical distance due to latency constraints. Asynchronous replication offers higher flexibility across geographical regions, but introduces the risk of minor data discrepancies, which must be accounted for within your RPO calculations. Modern architectures often rely on orchestrating these workflows through infrastructure as code, ensuring that the failover process is documented, repeatable, and capable of being executed without human error under stress. You must design these workflows to detect failures automatically and either trigger alerts for manual intervention or initiate automated cutover sequences based on predefined failover protocols. Validation of your business continuity plan is not a one-time project, but a continuous architectural feedback loop. Theoretical planning often collapses under the pressure of real-world scenarios, which is why tabletop exercises are essential for identifying gaps in communication, decision-making, and technical assumption. Beyond exercises, you must implement technical testing, such as live failover simulations, to verify that your cross-site dependencies do not break during an actual migration. This involves testing not just your database and server instances, but also your networking configurations, security policies, and identity provider accessibility at the alternate site. If your security controls, such as firewalls or IAM policies, do not mirror the failover site, you risk failing over only to find that your administrative access is blocked or your traffic is being dropped by stale security rules. Finally, ensure that the restoration process is securely integrated into your broader information systems security architecture. A disaster recovery state often lowers the defensive posture of an organization, as emergency protocols may inadvertently bypass existing security checks to prioritize speed. Your architecture must address this by ensuring that secondary or recovery environments possess the same level of logging, monitoring, and intrusion detection as the production primary site. Failure to maintain security rigor during crises invites sophisticated adversaries who may exploit the confusion of a failover event to gain persistence or exfiltrate data. By embedding these requirements into the initial design document, you ensure that resiliency does not come at the expense of the overall security architecture's integrity. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to the final session where we synthesize our approach to the ISSAP certification and refine our exam-taking strategy. We will focus on integrating architectural domains and mastering the nuances of the formal assessment process. To succeed in the ISAP exam, you must move beyond rote memorization of concepts and begin thinking like an enterprise security architect. Throughout this course, we have traversed governance, risk, infrastructure, and application security, but the exam specifically tests your ability to navigate the tension between these domains. When you encounter a complex scenario-based question, stop and identify the primary stakeholder and the business objective before evaluating the technical constraints. Most candidates fail not because they lack technical knowledge, but because they apply specialized knowledge in the wrong context or scale. Always ask yourself whether the solution is enterprise-wide or localized, as ISC2 expects you to consider long-term architectural stability over quick-fix solutions. Architecture is essentially a process of making sound trade-offs, and your goal is to select the option that best balances security requirements with operational and business realities. Effective time management during the exam requires a disciplined rhythm to avoid fatigue and cognitive tunneling. You should aim to maintain a steady pace, leaving yourself ample time to review your most uncertain answers at the end of the session. If a question feels overly ambiguous, utilize the Mark for Review feature and move on. Obsessing over a single item can compromise your ability to process the remaining questions. When you return to these difficult items, try reading the answers first to understand the architectural lens the question is applying. Often, you can eliminate half of the options immediately by checking them against core principles like the principle of least privilege or defense in depth. If two answers appear technically correct, choose the one that aligns most closely with documented industry frameworks like NIST, ISO, or TOGAF, as these are the baselines the examination board uses to validate accuracy. As we transition toward the final steps of your certification journey, remember that passing the exam is only one component of becoming an ISAP professional. You must ensure your supporting documentation for the required endorsement process is accurate and transparent, reflecting your professional experience in the specified domains. Once endorsed and certified, your responsibility to the profession continues through the accumulation of continuing professional education credits. Keep a structured, ongoing record of your learning activities, as maintaining your certification is a testament to your commitment to staying current in a rapidly evolving technological landscape. Your final study roadmap should prioritize domains where your actual job experience is shallowest, as those are the areas where you are most likely to experience cognitive dissonance during testing. Create a summary of key frameworks and their primary components to act as a cheat sheet for your final review sessions, ensuring that these high-level structures are firmly fixed in your working memory. Finalizing your preparation involves simulating the testing environment to acclimate yourself to the pressure of the exam interface. Avoid late-night cramming in the days immediately preceding the exam, as architect-level reasoning requires a rested and focused mind. Verify your testing location and logistics well in advance, and arrive early to minimize external stressors that have nothing to do with your technical competency. Trust the deep conceptual understanding you have built throughout this course, rather than second-guessing your intuition under time pressure. The ISC2 exam is designed to test your resilience and judgment as much as it tests your technical knowledge. You are now equipped with the architectural mindset necessary to address the complexities of modern enterprise security systems. I look forward to seeing you in our next session.